Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're traveling to a land where harsh realities met the most fantastical dreams, where saints and warriors walked the same misty paths, and where the boundary between history and mythology blurs like morning fog over emerald hills. We're journeying to medieval Ireland, a realm of wonder and mystery. If you're settling in for the night, this is your gentle reminder to dim the lights. Find that perfect position in your bed or chair and allow your breathing to slow. There's no rush here, no urgency, just the soft unfolding of stories from a distant time that somehow still whispers to us today. I've always found there's something particularly soothing about Irish history. Perhaps it's the rhythm of the ancient tales, or maybe it's the way the landscape itself seems to hold memories like a mother cradling her child. The rolling hills, the stone circles standing sentinel against time, the monasteries that once glowed with candlelight, as monks preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to the darkness of ages. All of these elements create a tapestry that's both melancholy and hopeful, both ordinary and magical. Let me know in the comments what country and city you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I love imagining all of you scattered across different time zones, different continents, yet connected through these quiet moments of reflection. Someone in Tokyo might be starting their day with this as gentle background, while someone in New York might be using these words as a bridge to dreamland. The thought of that connection across space and time feels appropriate when discussing a place like Ireland, where the past never seems very far from the present. Tonight, we'll walk through monasteries where candlelight danced on illuminated manuscripts. We'll sit in great halls where bards wove tales of heroes and monsters. We'll stand on battlements watching for Viking longships on the horizon. We'll hear the soft Latin prayers mixing with older, wilder incantations that refused to be forgotten. We'll feel the weight of clan loyalties and the comfort of community rituals that marked the turning of seasons. The medieval period in Ireland, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, wasn't simply a time of kings and castles. It was a period of extraordinary cultural flourishing amid hardship, of intellectual preservation during Europe's darkest hours, of artistic innovation that still captivates us today. It was a time when Ireland stood at the crossroads of ancient, native traditions and new influences from across the seas. As we journey through these centuries together, I invite you to let your mind wander these green paths. There's no test at the end, no need to remember dates or names. Just allow the rhythms of history to rock you gently, like a coracle on a calm lake, drifting toward the shores of sleep. Only if this helps you find peace tonight, consider subscribing to join our quiet community of history dreamers. But there's no pressure. Your rest is what matters most. Now, close your eyes if you haven't already. Breathe deeply. Let the sounds around you fade. We're about to step back into a time when stars were brighter, nights were darker, and the boundary between the possible and impossible wasn't quite as firm as we pretend it is today. Let yourself be carried away on this current of stories, flowing from a distant shore to the private harbour of your consciousness. Medieval Ireland awaits, with all its contradictions and wonders. And you're already beginning to drift there, aren't you? You wake in a stone cottage, the scent of peat smoke filling your lungs. The air carries other notes too. The earthiness of fresh bread, the subtle musk of sheep's wool hanging to dry, and underneath it all, the ever-present dampness that seems to be Ireland's most faithful companion. It's early morning, sometime in the 6th century, and you're in a small settlement nestled in a valley that will someday be part of County Meath. The thatched roof above you is blackened from years of smoke rising from the central hearth, where embers still glow from last night's fire. Light filters in dimly through the single window. Not glass, but a simple opening covered with oiled animal skin that allows a muted glow to penetrate the darkness. You've been sleeping on a straw mattress raised slightly off the packed earth. Floor, covered with rough woolen blankets, dyed a muted green with local plants. Outside, you hear the first stirrings of the settlement coming to life. A cow lows in the distance. Someone calls out in a language that isn't quite like anything you've heard before. Old Irish, with its musical cadence and Celtic roots still strongly intact, untouched by the linguistic evolutions that will shape it over the next 1,500 years. You rise and push aside the heavy cloth that serves as a door. The morning air carries a bite that makes you draw your cloak tighter around your shoulders. It's spring, but the nights are still cold, and the morning dew clings heavily to everything. The thatched roofs of the clustered homes, the wooden fence posts that keep livestock from wandering, the wild grasses that grow tall at the settlement's edge. The village is small, perhaps 20 dwellings arranged in a roughly circular pattern. At its centre stands not a church, as might be expected in later centuries, but a communal area where people gather to trade, settle disputes, and share news. Some homes are entirely of stone. Others combine wattle and daub with wooden supports. They speak of a people who have learned to use what the land provides, building homes that can withstand Ireland's mercurial weather. You notice how naturally the settlement blends into the landscape. These people don't fight against their environment, but exist in conversation with it. The boundaries between wild and tame spaces blur. Kitchen gardens grow alongside wild herbs. Domesticated animals graze near deer that venture cautiously from the surrounding forest. As you walk through the waking settlement, people nod to you. Their faces are weathered, their hands calloused from constant work, but their eyes hold a quiet dignity. Many wear simple tunics of wool or linen, secured at the waist with leather belts from which hang small tools or pouches. Colours come from natural dyes, the yellow of weld, the red of madder root, the blue of woad. Nothing gaudy, but these earth tones create a harmony with the landscape that surrounds them. A woman kneels beside the communal well, drawing water in a wooden bucket. Her hair is long and partially braided, with intricate patterns that suggest status and family connections. Around her neck hangs an amulet, a small cross combined with what appears to be a much older symbol, speaking to the blend of Christianity and native beliefs that characterizes this transitional period in Irish spiritual life. Beyond the settlement, you see fields divided by low stone walls that seem to grow organically from the earth itself. Some contain crops, oats, barley, and early vegetables, while others hold livestock. In the distance rises a round tower, part of a small monastery, established by followers of the new Christian faith that has been spreading across Ireland for over a century now. The monastery calls to you, and you find yourself walking along the well-worn path that connects the secular settlement to this sacred space. Birds call from the hedgerows, their songs unchanged by the passing of 15 centuries. A fox pauses to watch you from the edge of a field before melting back into the brush. The morning mist still clings to the lower parts of the valley, creating the impression that you're walking between worlds. As you approach the monastery, you hear chanting, morning prayers rising in Latin, a language that represents the connection between this remote Irish community and the broader Christian world beyond. The monastery itself is modest, a stone church, a round tower for protection and bell ringing, and several smaller buildings where monks live, work, and study. The monastery wall is low, more symbolic than defensive at this point in history. Later, as Viking raids become a reality, these walls will grow higher, the towers more fortress-like. But for now, there's an openness, a welcome extended to all who seek learning or spiritual comfort. You pass through the simple gate and enter a world of surprising colour and sound. In one corner of the courtyard, a monk tends to a garden of herbs used for medicine and cooking. Another sits on a simple wooden bench, carefully transcribing text onto vellum, his quill moving with practiced precision. The ink he uses, a deep black made from oak galls, catches the morning light as it dries. What strikes you most is the sense of purposeful tranquility. These men have dedicated their lives to preservation and contemplation in an age often characterized by hardship and uncertainty. They work to create beauty in their manuscripts, to tend to the sick with their herbal knowledge, and to maintain a rhythm of prayer that structures their days from dawn to dusk. A bell rings, its sound clear and penetrating in the morning air. The monks begin to move toward the small stone church for another service. Some nod to you. Visitors are not uncommon, as monasteries serve as places of hospitality and healing for the surrounding communities. You're welcome to observe, to rest, to learn. Inside the church, candles flicker against stone walls. The air holds the complex scent of beeswax, incense, and the damp stone that never quite dries in this climate. The monks arrange themselves on simple wooden benches. Their robes are undyed wool, representing their vow of simplicity, yet many wear small personal touches. A belt woven by a sister, a pouch containing a stone from a sacred well. Small remembrances of the families and communities they came from. Their voices rise in Gregorian chant, the notes echoing against the stone walls. The Latin words speak of eternal truths, yet occasionally you catch phrases in Old Irish, evidence of how the new faith is adapting to this land rather than simply imposing itself. The harmony of their voices creates a sound that seems to exist outside of time, connecting these early medieval practitioners to thousands of years of future worshippers who will sing these same notes. After the service, you wander the monastery grounds. In a small, well-lit room, several monks are engaged in the painstaking work of creating manuscripts. One mixes pigments, vibrant blues from lapis lazuli, reds from cinnabar, greens from copper compounds, and the precious gold that will make. Their pages seem to capture sunlight itself. Another carefully draws the intricate knotwork patterns that will eventually evolve into the spectacular illuminations of works like the Book of Kells. What you're witnessing is nothing less than the preservation of knowledge during an age when much of Europe has descended into chaos following the collapse of Roman authority. Here, in this remote corner of an island at the edge of the known world, these quiet scholars are maintaining the flame of learning, copying classical texts alongside biblical manuscripts, preserving stories and knowledge that might otherwise vanish forever. As the day progresses, you observe the rhythm of life that defines existence in this time and place. There is hard work, fields to tend, animals to care for, food to prepare, materials to craft into necessary items. But there is also community, shared meals, moments of storytelling around evening fires, the collective celebration of small joys and mutual bearing of inevitable sorrows. As the mist rolls back across centuries, you feel yourself sinking deeper into this green realm of contradictions, a place where Christian monks preserve pagan tales, where poetry is as valued as prowess in battle, where the supernatural doesn't seem so very far removed from the natural world. Medieval Ireland unfolds before you, inviting you to witness its complex beauty as you drift further into relaxation. In a land once devoted to ancient gods, a new faith takes root beside the old. The story of Christianity's arrival in Ireland is neither simple conquest nor seamless integration, but rather a gradual, complex conversation between cultures that would create something unique in medieval Europe. You can feel this tension and harmony as you walk between the stone circles of ancestral worship and the cross-marked slabs that rise from the same sacred earth. The traditional narrative tells us that Christianity came to Ireland with Patrick in the 5th century. Born in Roman Britain, captured by Irish raiders as a youth, and enslaved for 6 years before escaping, Patrick would later return to the land of his captivity as a missionary. But this clean narrative obscures a messier reality. Christianity had already begun to trickle into Ireland through trade contacts and earlier, less documented missionaries. Patrick's contribution was not introduction, but organization, not discovery, but dedication. Imagine him standing on the Hill of Slane in 433 CE, lighting the Paschal fire in defiance of the High King's decree that no flame should burn before the lighting of the royal fire at Tara during the pagan festival of Beltane. This moment, whether historical fact or symbolic legend, captures the intersection of competing spiritual worldviews. Yet what makes Irish Christianity remarkable is not the conflict, but the eventual harmony that emerged. As you move through an Irish landscape in the 6th and 7th centuries, you witness something extraordinary happening. Unlike the conversion process, in many European regions, where pagan temples were demolished to build churches on their foundations, in Ireland, the sacred sites often remain intact but reinterpreted. Holy wells once dedicated to goddesses now honor female saints. Seasonal festivals marking solstices and equinoxes become Christian feast days. The old and new coexist, speaking to each other across the threshold of formal conversion. You find yourself approaching a monastery nestled in a valley. Unlike the grand stone structures that will characterize later medieval architecture, this is a collection of simple buildings surrounded by a circular earthen embankment, a design echoing the ring forts of pre-Christian Ireland. Inside, the rhythm of life follows the canonical hours, prayers punctuating the day from matins before dawn to compline as darkness falls. The monks move between tasks with quiet purpose. Some tend gardens where medicinal herbs grow alongside, vegetables for the community kitchen. Others work with animal hides, scraping and stretching them to create the vellum pages that will become manuscripts. In a specially designed building with carefully positioned windows to maximize natural light, the most skilled artists and scribes labor over texts, not only biblical works, but also legal tracts, poetry, historical annals, and tales from Ireland's pre-Christian tradition. This preservation of native culture alongside Christian teaching marks Irish monasticism as distinct. While continental European monasteries certainly preserved classical knowledge, Irish monks embraced local traditions with unusual enthusiasm. They recorded myths of Cuchulainn and the Tuatha De Danann with the same care they devoted to psalters and gospels. The boundary between sacred and secular knowledge remained permeable, creating a cultural continuity that helped ease the transition between religious worldviews. The monasteries become centers of learning renowned throughout Europe. During what some historians call the Dark Ages, while much of the continent struggles with political fragmentation and cultural disruption following the collapse of Roman authority, Ireland, never having been part of the Roman Empire, experiences a golden age of scholarship and artistic innovation. You observe a class of young students gathered around an older monk. Some are local boys, sons of chieftains and farmers alike, for these monasteries serve as schools for the broader community. Others have travelled from as far as Francia and Saxony, drawn by Ireland's reputation for learning. They recite Latin texts, practice writing on wax tablets, and listen to explanations of scripture interpreted through distinctly Irish sensibilities. What emerges in these centres of learning is not just the preservation of knowledge, but its transformation. Irish monks develop a distinctive style of biblical interpretation, a unique form of Latin pronunciation, and most visibly, an artistic tradition that will reach its apex in works like the Book of Kells, the Book of Durrow, and the Lindisfarne, Gospels, created by monks trained in the Irish tradition. As evening approaches, you follow the community into the small stone church for Vespers. The interior is simple, yet beautiful, illuminated by beeswax candles that cast a warm glow on whitewashed walls. A few pieces of metalwork, a chalice, a processional cross, catch the light, their surfaces decorated with the intricate interlace patterns that characterize Celtic art. These objects represent another aspect of Irish Christianity, its integration with a pre-existing artistic tradition of astonishing sophistication. The prayers rise in Latin, but occasionally words of Old Irish enter the liturgy, especially in the hymns. This linguistic blending reflects the cultural synthesis taking place, not erasure of the native in favor of the imported, but a dialogue between traditions resulting in something new and distinctive. After the service, the community gathers for an evening meal. The food is simple: bread, cheese, perhaps fish from a nearby river, vegetables from the garden. The monks eat in silence as one of their number reads from a religious text. Yet afterward, as they move to the warming fire in the communal building, the atmosphere shifts. Now is the time for Seanachie, storytelling, a practice with roots deep in pre-Christian Irish culture but adapted to the monastic context. Tonight's tale weaves together the life of a local saint with older folk, motifs of magical animals, and encounters with the otherworld. The young foreign students listen with wide eyes, perhaps not understanding all the Irish words, but captivated by the rhythm and emotion of the telling. This too is education, the transmission of cultural memory through narrative, creating continuity between past and present, between different worldviews. What you're witnessing in these early Christian centuries is the formation of a unique religious culture. Irish Christianity develops distinctive features: a strong emphasis on asceticism influenced by Eastern desert monasticism, a particular reverence for scholarship, a willingness to incorporate pre-Christian cultural elements, and a missionary zeal that will eventually send Irish monks back out across Europe to establish monasteries and centers of learning in territories ravaged by political collapse and invasion. Figures like Columbanus, who established monasteries across continental Europe, and Columba, who founded the influential monastery at Iona off Scotland's coast, carry this distinctive Irish approach to Christianity outward, creating networks of influence that help revitalize European religious and intellectual life during a period often characterized as an age of darkness. Yet not all is harmony and scholarly tranquility. As you travel the Irish countryside, you also witness tensions between different monastic federations competing for influence, between monasteries and secular rulers negotiating power dynamics, between those advocating stricter Roman practices and those defending Irish traditions. One particular point of contention emerges around the correct calculation of Easter, a seemingly minor issue that represents broader questions about authority and identity. The Irish Church, developing somewhat in isolation, maintains older practices while Rome adopts new ones. When Rome eventually pushes for conformity across Western Christendom, some Irish communities resist, seeing in these calendar calculations a symbol of their distinctive religious culture. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, held in Northumbria, but addressing issues central to Irish Christianity, the Roman calculation is officially adopted, marking a turning point in the relationship between Irish Christianity and the broader church. Yet many Irish monasteries continue their distinctive practices, maintaining a tension between local tradition and universal authority that will characterize much of medieval religious history. As night falls, and you find yourself sitting beside a monastery's hearthfire, watching shadows dance across worn stone walls, you feel the layered complexity of this spiritual landscape. In the monks' chanting, you hear echoes of druidic incantations transformed but not erased. In the illuminated manuscripts they create, you see pre-Christian artistic motifs given new meaning but not abandoned. In their stories, you recognize ancient narrative structures carrying new spiritual content. The monks' quills scratch across parchment, each mark a bridge between worlds old and new, much like you now drift between wakefulness and dreams, carried on the current of history flowing beneath the surface of consciousness. The weight of a crown that was never truly a crown rests differently than one might imagine. As morning mist rises from the sacred hill of Tara, you stand amid ancient earthworks, circular mounds and ditches that speak of power held and contested since time beyond memory. This is the ceremonial seat of the High Kings of Ireland. Yet to understand Irish medieval politics is to release expectations shaped by continental European models of kingship. The concept of the High King, the Ard Rí, existed more in aspiration than absolute reality for much of Irish history. Unlike the centralized monarchies developing elsewhere in medieval Europe, Ireland's political structure remained fragmented, fluid, and intensely personal. Power emanated not from institutions, but from individuals whose ability to command loyalty determined their effective authority. You watch as a king and his retinue arrive at Tara for an oinach, a traditional assembly combining political, social, and ritual functions. The king wears gold torques and arm rings signifying his status, but no crown as would be recognized in other European courts. His claim to power rests on a combination of birthright, personal prowess, wealth distribution, and perceived favour from supernatural forces. Ireland in the medieval period was divided into approximately 150 tuatha, singular, tuath, small, kingdoms, each with its own king chosen from within a royal lineage, but not necessarily through strict primogeniture. Above these local kings were roughly 30 provincial kings, ri, and theoretically above them all stood the High King, though his actual power depended entirely on his ability to enforce recognition through alliances, hostage-taking, and military campaigns. As you observe the gathering at Tara, the complexity of these relationships becomes visible. Some kings approach the High King with genuine deference, presenting tribute and pledging loyalty. Others maintain a careful distance, offering minimal acknowledgement while closely guarding their autonomy. Guards stand watchful, hands never far from weapons, as ancient rivalries and recent grievances create currents of tension beneath ceremonial courtesy. What regulated this potentially volatile political landscape was not centralized bureaucracy, but an intricate legal system, the Brehon laws. You find yourself sitting in on a legal proceeding conducted not by the king, but by a Brehon, a professional jurist who has undergone years of training in memorizing and interpreting these native Irish laws. The case involves cattle theft between members of different tuatha, a common source of conflict in a society where cattle represented both wealth and status. The Brehon listens to testimonies, consults with other legal experts present, and eventually pronounces a judgment requiring compensation calculated with mathematical precision based on the value of the animals and the circumstances of the theft. This system of composition, payment for crimes rather than physical punishment, characterized Irish law and differed significantly from contemporaneous legal developments in England and continental Europe. The focus remained on restoration and compensation rather than retribution, preserving community cohesion in a political landscape where relationships were everything. The Brehon laws covered not only criminal matters, but also regulated nearly every aspect of society: marriage and divorce, land use, professional responsibilities, social status, and contracts. They recognized women's rights to property and legal agency to a degree unusual in medieval Europe. A married woman retained ownership of property she brought into the marriage and could divorce her husband on various grounds with appropriate compensation. Walking among the attendees at the Oenach, you notice the variety of social classes represented. Medieval Irish society operated on a hierarchical but somewhat fluid system. Kings and nobles, flaith, formed the upper echelon, followed by professional classes including brehons, poets, filed, physicians, and craftspeople. Below them were commoners, with varying degrees of status, mostly determined by wealth in land and cattle. At the bottom were unfree persons, those who had surrendered their freedom due to debt or as punishment for crimes. What bound this society together was not feudalism as developed elsewhere in Europe, but a system of clientship. Both free clients and base clients attached themselves to patrons of higher status, receiving land, cattle, or protection in exchange for rents, services, and political support. These bonds created a web of mutual obligation that defined public life. Family structures added another layer of complexity. The basic social unit was not the nuclear family, but the fine, an extended family group sharing legal responsibility and land rights. Land was not individually owned in the modern sense, but held by the fine and periodically redistributed among its members. A practice called gavel-kind that prevented consolidation of wealth, but also discouraged long-term land improvements. Afternoon shadows lengthen across Tara's ancient monuments. You witness a ritual central to Irish kingship, the symbolic marriage between the king and the land itself. This ceremony, with roots in pre-Christian belief, frames the king not as absolute ruler, but as one bound in sacred contract with the territory and people. Sovereignty is conceptualized as a feminine force that grants legitimacy to worthy rulers and withdraws it from those who fail their obligations. These obligations were detailed in early Irish literature, which describes the fir flathamon, the ruler's truth or justice that brought prosperity to the land. A just king would be rewarded with bountiful harvests, healthy cattle, and abundant fish. An unjust one would bring famine and disaster. This belief created a form of accountability unique to Celtic kingship traditions. The arrival of Christianity modified, but did not eliminate these concepts. You observe clerics at the gathering, their presence representing the growing influence of the church in political affairs. By the 8th century, church leaders participate in royal inaugurations, adding Christian blessing to traditional ceremonies. Monasteries accumulate land and power, becoming political players in their own right, and sometimes serving as neutral ground for negotiations between rival kingdoms. Yet even as Christianity reshapes aspects of Irish politics, native traditions persist. Poets retain their ancient role as not just entertainers but kingmakers and critics. You watch as a filly rises to deliver a praise poem for the High King, his words carrying not just flattery but subtle reminders of royal responsibilities. These poets possessed the power of satire, believed capable of raising facial blemishes on those they criticized, a devastating prospect in a culture where physical perfection was considered essential for kingship. The interplay between ideal and reality in Irish politics becomes increasingly apparent as you observe the High King managing competing claims and fragile alliances. Historical records suggest that no High King ever truly ruled all of Ireland without opposition. Even Brian Boru, often cited as the most successful High King, faced continuous challenges to his authority, despite his victory over Viking forces at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. This political fragmentation, while allowing for local autonomy and cultural diversity, would eventually render Ireland vulnerable to external intervention. As twilight approaches and the gathering at Tara prepares for evening feasting, there's a poignant quality to the elaborate protocols and ancient ceremonies. These traditions represented a sophisticated political system evolved for a specific context, but one that would struggle against more centralized powers in coming centuries. In the great roundhouse where the feast is held, you observe the rigidly maintained seating arrangements that reflect precise social gradations. Warriors boast of cattle raids and battles, poets recite genealogies stretching back to mythical ancestors, and kings exchange carefully calibrated gestures of respect or challenge. The hall is filled with smoke from the central hearth, the scent of roasting meat, and the sound of harps playing ancient melodies. What you witness is politics as performance, as relationship, as sacred obligation, conceptualized differently than the increasingly administrative kingship developing elsewhere in medieval Europe. It's a system both resilient in its flexibility and vulnerable in its divisions. Even as these kings claimed dominion over the island, forces beyond the horizon were already setting sail for these misty shores, bringing with them different conceptions of power, territory, and governance that would challenge the foundations of Ireland's ancient political order. The struggle for daily bread set against the feast of imagination. This contradiction defines the texture of ordinary lives in medieval Ireland. As dawn breaks over a small rural settlement, you observe the rhythms of existence that would be recognizable across centuries, yet colored by distinctly Irish patterns of community and belief. Most Irish people live not in towns, but in scattered, rural settlements centered around ring forts, circular enclosures surrounded by earthen banks or stone walls. These homesteads typically housed an extended family group along with their livestock and dependents. The landscape you see is dotted with these circular dwellings, smoke rising from their centers, each a small world unto itself yet connected to others through bonds of kinship, clientship, and shared cultural practices. The day begins early, with women kindling fires in the central hearths of roundhouses. The design is simple but effective, a circular structure with walls of stone, or wattle and daub, topped with a conical thatched roof. Smoke from the hearth rises to escape through a hole at the apex, though much of it lingers, creating a perpetual haze that helps preserve the thatch from insects, but also leads to respiratory ailments evident in skeletal remains from the period. Food preparation occupies much of the morning. The staples of the Irish diet were surprisingly diverse. Oats and barley for porridge and bread, dairy products from the cattle central to the economy, vegetables from kitchen gardens, wild plants, gathered from the surrounding countryside, meat, primarily from pigs but also cattle, sheep and wild game, and seafood in coastal regions. You watch as women work at quernstones, laboriously grinding grain by hand, while others tend to cauldrons suspended over the fire. The Irish approach to cooking emphasized boiling rather than baking, reflecting both available technology and fuel conservation, creating the stews and porridges that form dietary staples. Bread was typically unleavened and cooked on flat stones or griddles near the fire. While everyday meals were simple, you notice the careful attention to hospitality when travelers arrive. Better portions served, perhaps meat included where it might otherwise be absent, special seating arrangements observed. Outside, men tend to livestock, the true wealth of medieval Ireland. Cattle served not simply as food sources, but as the primary measure of status and means of exchange. Legal texts meticulously detailed cattle values, with prices varying based on age, sex, productivity, and even temperament. You observe the complex process of herding, milking, and managing these animals, with young boys learning these essential skills through direct participation. Agricultural work follows the seasonal cycle. In spring, simple plows, often pulled by oxen rather than horses, break the soil for planting. Summer brings constant vigilance against crop predators and weeds. Autumn harvest requires all hands, with communities often working cooperatively to bring in crops before rains can damage them. Winter focuses on indoor work, repairing tools, spinning wool, weaving textiles, and preserving foods. The technology is simple by modern standards, but sophisticated for its time. Iron tools, carefully maintained and repaired by local smiths, enable more efficient agriculture. Rotation of crops helps maintain soil fertility. Knowledge passed through generations allows for cultivation practices adapted to Ireland's wet climate and varied soil types. Clothing production occupies much of women's time during quieter agricultural periods. You watch as they card wool, spin it into thread using drop spindles, and weave on simple looms to create the wool fabrics that dominate Irish clothing. Linen from locally grown flax provides a lighter alternative for undergarments. Unlike the elaborate fashions developing in continental courts, Irish clothing remains relatively practical. Loose-fitting tunics and trousers for men, long dresses for women, with cloaks fastened by decorative brooches serving as protection against Ireland's persistent damp and chill. What distinguishes clothing is not its cut, but its colour and quality, with dyes and fine weaving signifying status. Yellow, traditionally reserved for royalty and poets, appears occasionally among the predominant earth tones. You notice that even in practical garments, there's often a decorative element, embroidery at the edges, a particular pattern in the weaving, or a specially crafted brooch that transforms necessity into personal expression. Children play near the settlement, their games combining physical training with cultural education. Boys practice spear throwing using sticks, engage in wrestling matches that prepare them for adult combat, and participate in ball games that will eventually evolve into hurling. Girls learn domestic skills through miniature versions of adult tasks, small drop spindles for spinning, tending to kitchen gardens, caring for younger children. Yet there's also time for games that cross gender boundaries, chasing, hiding, storytelling contests that shape young imaginations. Education in medieval Ireland follows multiple paths. For most children, learning occurs through apprenticeship to adult activities, beginning with simple tasks and progressing to more complex responsibilities. But you also observe more formal educational systems, fostering arrangements where children live with other families to learn specific skills, apprenticeships to craftspeople, and for a select few, training in specialized professions like brehon, lawyer, filly, poet, or cleric. The monasteries that dot the landscape serve not just religious functions, but educational ones, teaching literacy in both Latin and Old Irish to students from various backgrounds. This relatively widespread literacy distinguishes early, medieval Ireland from many contemporaneous European societies, creating a culture where written and oral traditions flourish side by side. As afternoon shadows lengthen, you notice how work rhythms adjust to daylight hours and seasons. During summer's long days, agricultural work extends into evening, while winter's early darkness brings communities together around hearthfires for the essential practice of storytelling. These are not merely entertainment, but living curriculum, transmitting historical knowledge, reinforcing social values, preserving technical information about agriculture and crafts, and maintaining spiritual understanding through myths and legends. Social bonds beyond immediate family emerge most visibly during community gatherings. You observe preparations for a local festival marking Lugnasa, the traditional harvest beginning in early August. Women prepare special foods, including the first fruits of the harvest. Men organize athletic competitions. Children practice songs and simple performances. Even in this Christian era, the celebration maintains elements of its pre-Christian origins, while incorporating newer religious observances. Such festivals punctuate the agricultural year. Imbolc, February 4th, marking the beginning of spring, and lambing season, Beltane, May 1st, celebrating the start of summer and movement of cattle to upland pastures. Lugnasa, August 1st, acknowledging harvest beginning, and Samhain, November 1st, marking summer's end and the start of the darker half of the year. Christianity overlays these observances with saints' days and liturgical celebrations, creating a calendar where sacred and secular, ancient and new, coexist and intertwine. The material culture surrounding you reveals both simplicity and sophistication. Most household items are crafted from locally available materials. Wooden bowls and cups, sometimes with metal accents for the wealthy, pottery containers, iron cooking implements, leather storage vessels. Yet even utilitarian objects often bear decorative elements. Carved patterns on wooden items, impressed designs on pottery, metalwork with distinctive Irish motifs. Special attention goes to items of personal adornment and objects used in communal gatherings. A drinking cup used at feasts might feature intricate carving or metal fittings. Jewelry, particularly brooches and pins needed to secure clothing, becomes a canvas for artistic expression and status display. Musical instruments, especially harps and horns, receive lavish decoration befitting their central role in social life. Health and medicine blend practical knowledge with spiritual practices. You observe a woman preparing herbal remedies from plants gathered according to specific traditions, some harvested during particular moon phases or on certain feast days, others requiring special prayers during collection. These botanical preparations address common ailments like coughs, digestive troubles, minor wounds, and childbirth complications. More serious medical situations might involve the services of specialized healers, whose knowledge combines empirical observation with ritual elements. Surgeons demonstrate surprising skill at setting bones and treating wounds, while midwives apply generations of collective knowledge to assist with childbirth. When these interventions prove insufficient, communities turn to spiritual healing, prayers to saints who have replaced earlier healing deities, pilgrimages to holy wells, protective amulets combining Christian and pre-Christian symbols. As evening approaches, families gather for the day's main meal, followed by a period of quiet industry in the lengthening shadows, mending, carving, preparing for tomorrow's work, all accompanied by soft conversation, or perhaps a song or tale from a family member with particular skill in entertaining. Night brings the community closer to the hearthfire, both for warmth and light. Sleep arrangements are communal by modern standards, family members sharing sleeping spaces, often on straw mattresses raised slightly from the floor, with valuable livestock sometimes brought inside during harsh weather or times of danger. The rhythm of their lives. Perhaps you might recognize echoes of your own daily patterns as you sink deeper into this shared human experience. The medieval Irish lived within constraints we can barely imagine today, yet they found ways to transcend mere survival through creativity, community, and spiritual connection. The household slowly settles for the night, with family members arranging themselves around the central hearth, where embers still provide gentle warmth and a soft orange glow that barely illuminates the interior. The day's final activities include checking that livestock are secure, ensuring the fire is banked to last through the night, and perhaps offering prayers that blend Christian devotion with older protective invocations. Sleep comes in cycles rather than the consolidated 8 hours familiar to modern people. First sleep lasts several hours, often followed by a period of quiet wakefulness, during which some might tend the fire, check on animals, or simply sit in contemplation. Second sleep follows until dawn's light signals the beginning of another day of labor and life. What strikes you most about these ordinary lives is their integration with natural rhythms. Without artificial light beyond rushes dipped in animal fat or precious beeswax candles, people rise and rest with the sun. Without mechanical timekeeping, days are measured by shadows, seasons by plant growth and animal behaviors, years by recurring, celestial patterns. This creates a different relationship with time itself, less linear, more cyclical, embedded in observation rather than abstraction. Social structures influence every aspect of daily experience. The fine, extended family, group, provides both support and obligation. No one faces hardship entirely alone, but neither can anyone claim complete autonomy. Decisions about land use, marriage arrangements, and resource allocation involve collective consideration. Disputes are resolved through established procedures involving local authorities, or, for more serious matters, travelling brehons who apply the intricate provisions of native Irish law. Marriage in medieval Ireland differs significantly from both modern expectations and contemporaneous practices elsewhere in Europe. While Christian influence increasingly promotes monogamy, earlier, traditions of polygyny and various recognized partnership types persist in practice if not in church teaching. Legal texts describe several categories of union with different property arrangements and social recognitions. The most formal marriages involve complex contractual agreements between families regarding property, bride price, and mutual obligations. Less formal arrangements exist with diminishing legal protections, but still within recognized social frameworks. Divorce remains relatively accessible by medieval standards, with provisions for property division based on which partner contributed what to the marriage and who bears responsibility for its dissolution. Children born within or outside formal marriages have different legal standing, but are generally incorporated into the family structure. Fostering, the practice of sending children to be raised in other households for educational or alliance-building purposes, creates additional kinship bonds that strengthen community cohesion. You observe children moving between households with an ease that suggests these extended family networks function as practical support systems rather than merely theoretical relationships. Craftsmanship reveals both pragmatic necessity and artistic sensibility. A woman shapes a clay pot, her fingers creating subtle patterns along the rim, not merely decorative, but serving to identify her work. A man repairs a leather harness, adding stitching patterns that go beyond functional requirements to express aesthetic preference. Even in mundane objects, you see evidence of individual hands and minds seeking beauty within utility. Specialized crafts require years of training and often involve closely guarded knowledge passed through generations. Metalworkers create tools, weapons and jewelry using techniques refined over centuries. Leatherworkers transform animal hides into practical items through complex processes of tanning, cutting, and joining. Woodworkers shape everything from structural timbers to delicate household objects, knowing precisely which wood types serve which purposes. The distinction between art and craft would be meaningless to these people. The same hands that forge farming implements also create decorative brooches. The minds that calculate structural engineering for buildings also envision the intricate knotwork decorating stone crosses. Beauty and function intertwine in a culture where limited material resources encourage making necessary things beautiful rather than creating separate, purely decorative objects. Community relationships extend beyond the familial to include complex networks of clientship, professional associations, and spiritual connections. You observe the careful navigation of these relationships, the appropriate gestures of respect toward a patron, the professional courtesy between practitioners of similar crafts, the shared participation in religious observances that bind community members together regardless of status differences. Laughter punctuates the day's labor. Humor provides essential relief from physical hardship and a means of social bonding. You overhear jokes playing on word meanings in the Irish language, humorous tales featuring stock characters recognizable to all listeners, good-natured teasing that maintains community standards while acknowledging human foibles. This laughter isn't merely recreational, but serves social functions of reinforcing bonds, releasing tensions, and transmitting cultural values. Music accompanies both work and leisure. Women sing rhythmic songs that coordinate group tasks like grinding grain or working wool. Men chant to synchronize efforts when moving heavy objects or rowing boats. Professional musicians, particularly harpists, enjoy special status, their skill considered partially supernatural in origin. At gatherings both formal and informal, music creates emotional landscapes, preserves historical memory, and enables the expression of feelings that might otherwise remain unspoken in a society that values stoic endurance. The natural and supernatural interpenetrate daily existence. You notice small rituals integrated into routine activities, a gesture made when passing certain trees, a whispered word when pouring water, a particular method of disposing of hair and nail clippings. These practices reflect a worldview where unseen forces require acknowledgement and respect, where boundaries between mundane and magical remain permeable. Christianity has transformed but not eliminated these older beliefs. Saints replace nature deities, but often absorb their attributes and sacred sites. Prayers include petitions to Christ and Mary alongside formulas with pre-Christian roots. Holy wells once dedicated to goddesses now bear saints' names, but still receive offerings of coins and cloth strips. This syncretic approach creates a spiritual landscape where multiple belief systems coexist within individual minds and community practices. The physical environment itself carries layers of meaning beyond its material properties. Certain hills are avoided not because they present physical danger, but because they're considered dwelling places of the Aos, the supernatural beings thought to inhabit a parallel world intersecting with the human realm. Ancient monuments from earlier periods, stone circles, passage tombs, standing stones, are integrated into the medieval Irish mental map, explained through legends and approached with appropriate respect. As night fully descends and the settlement grows quiet except for the occasional call of nightbirds or distant wolves, you sense how differently these people experience darkness. Without constant illumination, night represents not merely the absence of day, but an alternative state with its own rules and inhabitants. Stories whispered around dying embers speak of those who wander after dark. Both human outlaws and supernatural beings believed to grow more active when humans retreat indoors. In the rhythm of their lives, perhaps you might recognize echoes of your own daily patterns as you sink deeper into this shared human experience. Despite the vast differences in technology and belief, certain fundamentals remain recognizable across centuries. The need for sustenance and shelter, the desire for beauty and meaning, the importance of human connection, the attempt to understand forces beyond human control. These medieval Irish lives, constrained by material limitations but rich in cultural resources, remind us that human ingenuity and resilience find expression in every historical context. As the last whispers fade and sleep claims the community, you drift alongside them, carried by the currents of history toward deeper understanding, or perhaps toward dreams of your own. Words that float like mist between generations. In medieval Ireland, the spoken word carried power that we can scarcely comprehend in our text-saturated world. While monasteries preserved knowledge through writing, the broader culture maintained a sophisticated oral tradition that transmitted history, law, genealogy, and cultural identity through carefully memorized speech and performance. At the center of this oral culture stood the filii, plural, Philid, poets, who underwent rigorous training lasting up to 12 years to master their complex art. Unlike simple entertainers, these poets held formal legal status, with their rights and responsibilities carefully detailed in Brehon law. They served as the culture's memory keepers, historians, satirists, and praise singers, their words believed to possess almost magical efficacy. You find yourself at a chieftain's court as evening falls, watching a Fili prepare to perform. His status is immediately apparent. His clothing marks him as a member of the privileged Nemed class, with specific entitlements to protection and maintenance from noble patrons. Before he speaks, a respectful hush falls over the gathering. What you're about to witness isn't merely entertainment, but a cultural institution essential to maintaining social order and collective identity. The performance begins with genealogical recitation, an intricate verbal map tracing the chieftain's ancestry back through generations to semi-mythical founders. This isn't just flattery, but functions as political legitimation, establishing the ruler's right to authority through bloodlines. The Fili recites hundreds of names without error, employing mnemonic techniques developed over centuries of professional practice. When he shifts to narrative poetry, you notice the sophisticated techniques that aid both performance and memory. Irish verse employed patterns of alliteration, internal rhyme, and strict syllabic counts that created predictable structures for both performer and audience. These technical constraints, rather than limiting expression, generated creative solutions that became distinctive stylistic features of the tradition. The content blends historical events with mythological elements, presenting an integrated worldview where the supernatural and natural coexist. Tales of the Ulster cycle featuring Cú Chulainn, the Fenian cycle centered on Finn MacCumhail, the mythological cycle detailing the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the historical cycle focusing on kings, all form a complex narrative ecosystem that explains Irish society to itself, providing both entertainment and moral instruction. Beyond the court poet, you encounter other specialized practitioners of verbal arts. The Seanchai, storyteller, maintains local histories and folk tales, typically performing in more intimate settings than the formal court. The bard, ranking below the Fili in the professional hierarchy, focuses more on entertainment through music and less prestigious forms of poetry. Each fills a specific cultural niche, together creating a complete system for knowledge transmission that functions alongside, but distinct from, manuscript culture. Music intertwines inseparably with verbal performance. You witness a harper playing, an instrument whose design has remained relatively stable for centuries. A triangular frame strung with wire strings played with trimmed fingernails rather than plucking fingers. The status of harpers approaches that of poets. Some legendary musicians like Turlough O'Carolan will eventually bridge both worlds, creating compositions that survive through both oral transmission and eventual transcription. Other instruments accompany different performance contexts. Frame drums marking rhythm for work songs, bone flutes and wooden whistles playing dance melodies at community gatherings, ceremonial horns announcing important arrivals or marking significant moments. Each contributes to a rich soundscape that structures experience and preserves cultural memory through auditory rather than visual means. You notice how performance adapts to physical space. In the Chieftain's Hall, formal recitation projects to reach all listeners with architectural features sometimes designed to enhance acoustics. In smaller domestic settings, storytelling becomes more intimate, with teller and audience physically closer, allowing for subtle vocal modulations and facial expressions that add meaning. Outdoors, performances at fairs and festivals employ different techniques to command attention amid competing activities. The relationship between performer and audience reveals itself as reciprocal rather than passive. Listeners respond with conventional exclamations at appropriate moments, sometimes ask clarifying questions about genealogical connections, and visibly react to emotional high points in narratives. This interaction shapes the performance, with experienced performers adjusting emphasis and pacing based on audience engagement, an adaptive process impossible in fixed written texts. memory techniques fascinate you as you observe master poets training apprentices. The methods combine physical, spatial, and linguistic mnemonics. Some poets learn texts while fingering beads or stones, creating tactile associations with specific passages. Others mentally map content onto familiar landscapes, associating narrative elements with physical features. Rhythmic patterns and formulaic expressions create predictable frameworks that reduce memory burden while maintaining verbal artistry. These memorization methods weren't simply mechanical, but integrated with understanding. A poet was expected not merely to recite, but to comprehend the legal principles, historical contexts, and cultural significance of the material. This combination of verbatim recall and interpretive flexibility allowed the tradition to maintain stability while adapting to changing circumstances, a dynamic conservation rather than rigid preservation. The content transmitted through these oral channels encompassed practically all knowledge domains. Legal principles detailed in the Brehon laws were preserved partially through specialized legal poetry, making abstract concepts memorable through concrete imagery and rhythmic phrasing. Medical knowledge combined empirical observation with verbal formulas believed to enhance healing efficacy. Agricultural expertise embedded itself in seasonal songs that reminded communities when to plant, harvest, or move livestock. Perhaps most striking is how genealogical knowledge structured social relationships. You observe how recitation of kinship connections establishes not just individual identity, but obligations between groups. When a poet names the ancestors shared between currently feuding families, he reminds listeners of bonds that transcend immediate conflicts. When he traces connections between Irish dynasties and continental European nobility, he places local politics within an international context. These verbal maps of relationship serve practical functions in a society where knowing who owes what to whom determines everyday interactions. Christianity brought literacy, but didn't displace oral tradition. Instead, the two systems developed complementary relationships. Monks transcribed previously oral material, preserving tales that might otherwise have been lost as societal structures changed. Poets incorporated Christian elements into traditionally structured compositions, creating cultural continuity through formal stability despite content evolution. Some individuals moved between these worlds, with monasteries sometimes training poets, and poets occasionally entering monastic life in later years. The legal standing of poets gradually changed as medieval centuries progressed. Early law texts describe elaborate entitlements for different grades of poets based on training levels and repertoire mastery. Higher-ranking poets could claim significant hospitality rights, freedom of movement between territories, and exemption from certain legal obligations. These privileges reflect their essential cultural function, but occasionally generated conflict with other power centers, particularly the church, which sometimes criticized poetic privileges as excessive. Irish society recognized the potential danger in poetic speech, particularly satire. A poet's mockery wasn't merely embarrassing, but was believed capable of inflicting physical blemishes, significantly damaging a ruler whose perceived physical perfection connected to territorial prosperity. This belief created accountability mechanisms in both directions. Rulers needed to act justly to avoid legitimate satire, while poets faced penalties for unjustified mockery. The system balanced power between verbal specialists and political authorities. The everyday presence of verbal art extended beyond formal performance contexts. Work songs coordinated collective labor, their rhythms matching physical movements for threshing, rowing, or weaving. Lullabies transmitted cultural values while soothing children to sleep. Keening, ritualized mourning poetry performed primarily by women at funerals, gave structure to grief while preserving memory of the deceased through formulaic but personalized lamentation. As evening deepens and formal performances conclude, the gathering shifts to participatory verbal arts. Community members contribute shorter tales, personal anecdotes, or songs within their capability. This democratic aspect of oral culture ensures broad participation in cultural transmission while maintaining space for specialized mastery. Not everyone can be a fili, but everyone can engage meaningfully with the shared verbal inheritance. What you're witnessing isn't simply pre-technological information storage, but a comprehensive system for maintaining cultural coherence through shared narrative, rhythmically embedded knowledge, and performative reinforcement of collective identity. These verbal arts don't merely describe the world, but actively create it by establishing relationships, preserving memories, and structuring experience through linguistic patterns that connect present moments to ancestral wisdom. As the bard's voice fades into the crackling fire, another kind of story begins to unfold in stone and mortar, the architectural narrative of medieval Ireland, where structures themselves speak of power, protection, and devotion across centuries of turbulent history. Walls built to keep out that now invite us in. The defensive structures of medieval Ireland tell stories of changing power dynamics, technological adaptation, and the human need for security in uncertain times. As you travel across the landscape, you witness the evolution of fortifications, from simple earthworks to sophisticated stone castles, each representing specific historical moments and cultural intersections. The earliest medieval defensive structures you encounter are ring forts, circular enclosures surrounded by earthen banks or stone walls, sometimes with external ditches for additional protection. These ubiquitous features of the Irish landscape, with over 45,000 identified, primarily protected homesteads and small communities, rather than serving military functions in the modern sense. Standing within one, you notice its modest scale, typically 20 to 60 meters in diameter, designed to secure a single extended family, their livestock, and possessions against small-scale raids rather than organized armies. The construction methods vary by region and available materials. In areas with abundant stone, walls rise in dry stone technique, carefully fitted rocks without mortar, thicker at the base and tapering upward. In regions where timber and earth predominate, banks formed from the material excavated from surrounding ditches create the protective barrier, sometimes topped with wooden palisades or defensive thorny hedges. These ring forts represent security, concerns in a society where cattle raiding formed a normalized aspect of inter-Tuath relations. Young warriors proved themselves through successful raids, while defending against them demonstrated a lord's ability to protect his clients. The ubiquity of these structures speaks to a political landscape characterized by small-scale but persistent conflict rather than large-scale warfare. As the early medieval period progresses, you observe specialized defensive sites emerging for elites. Crannogs, artificial islands constructed in lakes, provide naturally defensible locations accessed only by boat or narrow causeways easily removed in times of danger. Standing on one of these carefully engineered platforms, you appreciate how they combine practical defense with status display, their construction requiring significant resources and labor that demonstrated a lord's wealth and influence. The arrival of Christianity introduces new architectural forms with defensive elements. Round towers, tall, slender stone structures with elevated doorways, emerge as distinctive features of important ecclesiastical sites by the 10th century, primarily built to protect valuable church treasures and manuscripts during raids. They also served as bell towers and visual markers of monastic presence in the landscape. You climb the narrow internal stairs of one such tower, noting how the high entrance, accessible only by ladder, could be easily defended during attacks. The Viking incursions beginning in the late 8th century catalyze further defensive innovations. Coastal communities develop specialized fortifications against seaborne raids. Urban settlements established by Norse-Irish populations introduce new forms to the Irish landscape, linear walls protecting streets and structures rather than the circular enclosures traditional to Gaelic Ireland. In Dublin, Waterford, and other Viking-founded towns, you see the beginnings of urban fortification patterns that will characterize later medieval development. The most dramatic transformation in Irish defensive architecture follows the Anglo-Norman invasions beginning in 1169. These newcomers bring continental castle-building technology that fundamentally alters the relationship between military architecture and political power. The initial Norman fortifications, Motte and Bailey castles, can be constructed relatively quickly to establish control over newly conquered territories. You stand atop a motte, raised earthen mound, looking down at the bailey, enclosed courtyard, below, understanding how this elevated position provided both practical defensive advantage and visible assertion of Norman authority over the surrounding landscape. As Norman control solidifies in certain regions, temporary earthworks give way to stone castles of increasing sophistication. The earlier stone keeps, rectangular towers with thick walls, represent both military necessities and symbolic statements. Their construction requires specialized knowledge, substantial resources, and political stability. All demonstrations of Norman administrative capabilities absent in earlier Gaelic systems. Walking through a 13th century castle, you notice the careful attention to defensive details. Arrow loops allow defenders to fire on attackers while remaining protected. Projecting machicolations permit dropping objects on enemies who reach the base of walls. The main entrance incorporates multiple security features: drawbridges, portcullises, and murder holes, creating lethal obstacles for potential invaders. These technical innovations reflect the increasing professionalization of warfare and the growing resources dedicated to military architecture. Castle layouts evolve from simple keeps to complex concentric designs with multiple lines of defense. The concept of defense in depth becomes standard practice, with each perimeter designed to weaken attacking forces before they reach inner structures. You observe how terrain features integrate with architectural elements: cliff edges, river bends, or marshy ground, complementing constructed defenses to create comprehensive security systems. Daily life within these defensive structures reveals their function as centers of administration, not merely military installations. The Great Hall serves for judicial proceedings and community gatherings. Storage facilities hold agricultural surpluses from surrounding lands. Specialized workshops accommodate craftspeople serving the castle community. Private chambers for the lord and family indicate the castle's role as residence, not simply fortress. What began as imposed foreign architecture gradually transforms into integrated administrative centers where Gaelic and Norman traditions intermingle. Not all regions experience this architectural transformation equally. In areas where Norman control remains contested or never fully establishes, traditional Gaelic defensive structures persist or adapt. Some Irish leaders adopt aspects of Norman castle design without embracing the administrative systems they originally represented. Tower houses, smaller, vertically oriented defensive structures, emerge in the later medieval period as a distinctive Irish adaptation combining elements from both traditions, suitable for the fragmented political landscape of Gaelic lordships. The physical experience of these spaces differs dramatically from modern expectations. Stone walls retain the day's heat, releasing it slowly through cold nights. Limited window openings create patterns of light and shadow that mark time's passage differently than in our artificially illuminated world. Sound behaves distinctively. Voices echo in great halls. Footsteps resonate on stone stairs. External noises filter differently through narrow openings designed for defense rather than light or air circulation. These sensory aspects remind you that defensive architecture shaped everyday experience, not just exceptional moments of conflict. Communities surrounding castles develop symbiotic relationships with these structures. Markets emerge in their shadows, offering some protection by proximity. Religious foundations, often established or patronized by castle lords, create spiritually significant counterpoints to military power. Agricultural activities orient around providing for castle inhabitants, while benefiting from their protection. The castle becomes not an isolated fortress, but the center of a complex social ecosystem. Archaeological evidence reveals how these defensive spaces were actually used rather than merely how they were designed. Everyday objects found in excavations, cooking implements, gaming pieces, personal ornaments, tools for various crafts, indicate that life continued in these spaces between moments of conflict. While prepared for war, most castles primarily experienced peace, functioning as administrative centers, residences, and symbols of authority rather than active battlegrounds. As political circumstances change through later medieval centuries, many defensive structures adapt to new functions. Some castles transform into more comfortable residences with larger windows, elaborate gardens, and decorative elements prioritized over defensive capabilities. Others fall into strategic obsolescence as political centers shift elsewhere. Some suffer deliberate destruction during conflicts, while others experience gradual abandonment as maintaining their extensive structures becomes unsustainable for declining lordships. By the close of the medieval period, the Irish landscape holds layers of defensive architecture representing different historical moments, cultural traditions, and political realities. From simple ring forts to elaborate stone castles, from crannogs to tower houses, these structures tell stories of how people sought security in changing circumstances, adapted foreign influences to local needs, and expressed power through architectural statements. What remains today are often romantic ruins that obscure their original pragmatic functions. Standing amid crumbling walls now colonized by vegetation, it's easy to forget the lived reality of these spaces, the constant maintenance they required, the communities they protected and controlled, the political statements they embodied. Yet in their silent stone presence, they continue to connect us to the complex human needs for both security and status that drove their creation. These stones have witnessed centuries of dreams, not unlike yours tonight. Hopes for safety, aspirations for status, fears quieted by solid walls, prayers whispered in chapel corners. As you drift deeper into comfort, these ancient structures continue their patient watching, bridging the centuries between their builder's world and our own. The terrible beauty of conflict on the Emerald Isle. Medieval Irish warfare evolved through distinct phases, shaped by cultural traditions, available technologies, and external influences. Unlike the increasingly standardized military practices developing in continental Europe during the same period, Irish conflict maintained distinctive characteristics while selectively adopting foreign innovations. Early medieval Irish warfare centered around cattle raiding rather than territorial conquest or pitched battles. The Tyne cattle raid represented both practical economic action and ritualized activity through which young warriors established reputation and lords demonstrated power. You witness preparations for such a raid. Warriors painting their bodies with woad-derived colors, reciting boasting poems about past exploits, consulting druids or clerics about auspicious timing. The atmosphere combines nervous energy with ceremonial formality, suggesting warfare's nature as performance, as much as practical violence. Combat equipment reflects both status and function. Elite warriors wear leather armor reinforced with metal plates, carry wooden shields often covered with hide and decorated with distinctive personal emblems, and wield a characteristic array of weapons. The most prestigious is the sword, initially short iron blades in the early period, later evolving to longer, more sophisticated weapons, influenced by Viking and Norman designs. Spears serve as both throwing and thrusting weapons, while axes, particularly popularized after Viking contact, provide devastating close combat capability. The lower status fighters who make up the majority of raiding parties carry simpler equipment, wooden clubs, basic spears, agricultural tools repurposed for combat. Their protection comes primarily from leather garments and wooden shields rather than metal armor. This equipment disparity reflects warfare's close connection to social hierarchy, with combat resources distributed according to status rather than tactical efficiency. Battle tactics emphasize individual heroics rather than disciplined formation fighting. Before engagement, champion warriors might step forward for single combat that could potentially resolve conflicts with minimal bloodshed. You observe how these duels follow ritualized patterns, formal challenges, recitation of genealogies, establishing combatants' status, regulated fighting governed by honor codes rather than simply seeking maximum damage. When forces do engage more broadly, they typically form loose groups rather than tight formations, with individual warriors seeking personal glory through observable, brave actions. The landscape itself shapes conflict practices. Ireland's extensive woodlands, wetlands, and rugged terrain discourage the large-scale formation tactics developing elsewhere in Europe. Instead, warfare adapts to environment with ambush tactics, strategic use of difficult terrain to disadvantage opponents, an emphasis on mobility rather than holding ground. Rivers and lakes serve both as defensive barriers and transportation routes for raiding parties capable of moving. As Norse incursions begin in the late 8th century, Irish warfare undergoes its first major external influence. Viking tactics, particularly their use of compact shield walls and their seamanship enabling coastal raids, present new challenges, requiring adaptive responses. Some Irish kingdoms develop specialized defensive arrangements for coastal regions, while others adopt elements of Norse military organization and equipment. The Irish long battle axe emerges during this period as a distinctive weapon combining Norse influence with Irish fighting styles. You notice changes in defensive architecture correlating with these tactical developments. Coastal communities construct specialized fortifications against seaborne raids. Inland settlements increasingly locate near naturally defensible positions or enhance existing ring forts with deeper ditches and higher banks. Ecclesiastical centers, primary targets for early Viking raids seeking portable wealth, develop protective features including the distinctive round towers. Chronicles from this period reveal changing scales of conflict. While cattle raids continue, larger confrontations involving multiple Tuatha kingdoms become more common. Battle narratives emphasize head counts of slain enemies and named fallen champions, suggesting warfare increasingly aims at inflicting casualties rather than simply capturing wealth. Political consolidation processes create larger kingdoms capable of fielding more substantial forces, though nothing approaching the scale of continental armies. The most significant transformation in Irish warfare follows the Anglo-Norman invasions, beginning in 1169. Norman military technology, particularly heavy cavalry, crossbowmen, and sophisticated siege equipment, represents a dramatic advantage over traditional Irish methods. You observe a Norman cavalry charge with mounted knights in chainmail, carrying lances and kite-shaped shields, presenting a cohesive fighting unit unlike anything in native Irish tradition. Their disciplined approach, professional military class, and siegecraft capabilities enable rapid conquest of significant territories. Irish adaptation to these challenges occurs unevenly across regions. In areas directly under Norman control, military practices conform to continental standards, with castle building, reorganized landholding supporting dedicated knights, and adoption of Norman weapons and armor. In regions maintaining Gaelic independence, selective adoption occurs. Certain weapon types and armor styles spread without the social structures that originally supported them elsewhere. By the 13th-14th centuries, a distinctive hybrid approach characterizes many Irish conflicts. The gallowglass, mercenary warriors originally from Hebridean and Highland Scottish backgrounds, emerge as important military specialists. These professional soldiers, typically equipped with mail armor, two-handed axes, and later claymore, swords, serve Irish lords but bring fighting techniques developed in Scottish contexts. Standing among a company of gallowglass, you note their professional demeanor contrasting with the more ritualized approach of traditional Irish warriors. These are men who fight for pay rather than primarily for honor or cattle. Kerns, lightly armored Irish foot soldiers, develop as a complementary force, specializing in rapid movement, javelin attacks, and exploitation of difficult terrain. The combination of gallowglass heavy infantry and kern light skirmishers creates a flexible military system adapted to Irish conditions while incorporating elements from various traditions. This hybrid approach proves effective enough that English authorities repeatedly legislate against hiring gallowglass, recognizing the military challenge they present to expansion of crown control. The later medieval period sees increasing use of mercenary forces on all sides of Irish conflicts. The practice of coin and livery, forcible billeting of warriors among civilian populations and exacting their support, becomes simultaneously a necessary military funding mechanism and a significant burden on communities. Chronicles from the period contain frequent complaints about both native Irish and English forces imposing these extractions, suggesting warfare's growing separation from community integration that characterized earlier periods. Technological developments gradually influence Irish warfare despite cultural resistance. Archery never achieves the prominence it holds in English military doctrine, but crossbows and longbows find increasing use, particularly in areas of Norman settlement. Body armor evolves from mail to plate in elite contexts, though equipment quality varies widely between central areas, with international trade access and peripheral regions relying more on local production. By the close of the medieval period, early firearms appear in more important engagements, though their reliability issues limit their tactical impact. Throughout these developments, environmental factors continue shaping conflict practices. Ireland's weather, particularly frequent rain, affects the reliability of bowstrings and early firearms. Dense woodlands limit the effectiveness of heavy cavalry in many regions. Rivers and loughs maintain their importance as both barriers and transportation routes. Seasonal considerations influence campaign timing, with winter conditions making many areas practically impassable for large forces. The human experience of this warfare contrasts sharply with romantic notions of medieval combat. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains shows patterns of traumatic injury, partially healed wounds suggesting survival of serious combat damage, distinctive skeletal markers indicating habitual weapons training from young ages, fatal injuries showing the brutal effectiveness of medieval weapons against human bodies. These physical traces remind us that beyond tactical discussions lie individual experiences of pain, fear, courage, and loss. Non-combatant experiences of warfare leave fewer direct archaeological traces, but emerge in textual sources. Chronicles describe crop destruction as standard practice, civilian displacement during conflicts, and occasional massacres following successful sieges. Women's roles in warfare contexts include supporting functions, food preparation, medical care, equipment maintenance, but also occasionally direct participation, particularly in siege contexts where all available defenders might be mobilized regardless of gender norms. Intellectual frameworks surrounding warfare evolve throughout the medieval period. Early Irish concepts emphasize individual honor, appropriate behavior within status boundaries, and conflicts ideally resolved through regulated violence rather than indiscriminate destruction. Christian influences gradually introduce just war concepts, while pragmatic Norman approaches prioritize effectiveness over traditional constraints. By the later medieval period, these different traditions create a complex ethical landscape where participants might judge the same actions according to different standards. The spiritual dimension of warfare remains present across these changes. Early warriors seek supernatural advantages through charms, ritual preparations, and invoking ancestral figures. Christian practices later provide alternative spiritual frameworks: mass before battle, carrying relics for protection, vows made to patron saints. These spiritual elements never disappear from Irish warfare regardless of technological or tactical developments, reflecting conflict's existential nature beyond simply political or economic calculations. The blood soaks into soil that will, centuries later, grow the greenest grass, a reminder that all struggles eventually fade into peace. Violence leaves its mark on the landscape, in defensive structures, in settlement patterns, oriented around protection needs, even in place names commemorating battles or slain heroes. Yet nature gradually reclaims these sites, transforming scenes of terrible struggle into peaceful pastoral settings, where sheep graze undisturbed by memories of what transpired centuries before. Perhaps this natural healing process offers its own kind of solace as you contemplate the cycle of conflict and recovery that characterizes not just Irish history, but human experience more broadly. The horizon darkens with dragon-prowed ships. The arrival of Norse raiders and settlers represents one of medieval Ireland's most significant external influences, transforming coastal regions, introducing new urban patterns, and catalyzing political developments that would reshape the island's trajectory. As you stand on an eastern shoreline sometime in the early 9th century, the distinctive silhouettes of longships approaching on the horizon signals the beginning of this complex intercultural encounter. The initial Norse incursions beginning around 795 CE targeted vulnerable coastal monasteries, Lambay Island, Inishmurray, Inishbofin, sites chosen not for territorial control, but for their concentrated portable wealth in the form of religious objects, manuscripts with valuable bindings, and stored food supplies. These early raids exhibited shocking violence by contemporary standards, particularly their targeting of religious communities previously considered protected by spiritual sanctions. Chronicles describe the horror of monks slaughtered, sacred, objects defiled, and manuscripts destroyed, traumatic events that represented not just physical destruction, but profound spiritual violation. You witness a monastic community in the aftermath of such a raid, buildings smouldering, survivors burying their dead, precious objects hastily hidden in anticipation of future attacks. The psychological impact extends beyond material damage, challenging Irish Christians' understanding of divine protection and prompting theological questions about why God would permit sacred spaces to suffer such desecration. As the Viking presence evolves from seasonal raiding to permanent settlement in the mid-9th century, interaction patterns grow more complex. The establishment of coastal long forts, ship fortresses, creates secure bases allowing deeper penetration into interior waterways. Standing at Annagassan in County Louth, or Dublin's original site at the Poddle Liffey confluence, you observe how these settlements occupy strategically valuable locations, controlling both sea access and interior river routes. Unlike indigenous, Irish settlements typically located for agricultural advantage, these Norse foundations prioritize commercial and military considerations. Deep harbours, defensible headlands, navigable rivers. The Norse settlements gradually transform from military bases into Ireland's first true urban centres. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork and Limerick emerge as distinctive settlement forms unlike anything in native Irish tradition. Commercial hubs with planned street layouts, specialised craft quarters, defensive walls and cosmopolitan populations. Archaeological excavations at Dublin's Wood Quay site reveal international trade connections through artefacts originating from Scandinavia, continental Europe, the Byzantine Empire and even Arabic regions, evidence of commercial networks extending far beyond Ireland's previous economic horizons. Walking through 10th century Dublin, you experience an environment markedly different from indigenous Irish settlements. The sounds of multiple languages, Norse, Irish, Saxon, Frankish, blend in marketplaces where silver is weighed for transactions rather than exchanged in kind, as in traditional Irish practice. Specialised craftspeople, many using techniques imported from Scandinavian tradition, work in distinct areas. Jewellers creating pieces blending Irish and Norse motifs. Leatherworkers producing goods for international trade. Woodworkers building ships and structures in distinctive Norse styles. The commercial energy contrasts with the primarily agricultural focus of traditional Irish settlements, introducing market-based economic elements previously minimal in Irish society. The material culture emerging from this interaction reveals complex processes of cultural exchange rather than simple dominance. Jewelry styles blend Celtic and Norse design elements, creating distinctive Hiberno-Norse aesthetic traditions. Weapon forms incorporate features from both cultures, producing hybrid types that spread across regions regardless of their inhabitants' ethnic identity. Language borrowings occur in both directions, with Norse contributing terms relating particularly to shipping, warfare, and commerce, while absorbing Irish vocabulary for local environmental features and cultural practices. Religious dimensions of the Norse presence show particularly interesting developmental patterns. Initially arriving as pagans whose willingness to attack churches shocked contemporary observers, Viking settlers gradually convert to Christianity through multiple pathways: intermarriage with Irish Christians, political alliances requiring religious conformity, and genuine spiritual conversion. By the mid-10th century, many Hiberno-Norse communities maintain Christian practice while preserving distinctive cultural traditions, creating another layer in Ireland's already complex religious landscape. Political relationships between Norse settlers and Irish kingdoms defy simple categorization. In some regions, persistent hostility characterizes interactions, with Irish kings organizing resistance against foreign presence. The careers of figures like Sirbal mac Dunlain of Osraige demonstrate sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering, sometimes allying with Norse forces against Irish rivals, other times opposing Viking expansion. By the 10th century, Hiberno-Norse communities increasingly participate in Irish political networks through marriage alliances, military partnerships, and formal submissions, blurring distinctions between native and foreign political entities. The most significant political development catalyzed by Norse presence was accelerated consolidation of power among Irish kingdoms. The necessity of organizing effective resistance against external threats advantages larger political units capable of mobilizing substantial forces. Brian Boru's rise to unprecedented power exemplifies this process, culminating in his famous victory at Clontarf in 1014, a battle against an alliance including both Norse and Irish forces, demonstrating how oversimplified narratives of Irish versus Viking fail to capture medieval Ireland's political complexity. Daily life in areas of Hiberno-Norse settlement reveals practical cultural adaptation rather than rigid separation. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts shows foodways incorporating both traditions. Norse cooking techniques applied to Irish ingredients, distinctive pottery forms serving culturally mixed households. Children grow up bilingual, navigating between cultural traditions with the flexibility characteristic of borderland populations throughout history. Religious practice incorporates elements from both traditions, with churches in Hiberno-Norse towns employing Irish clergy while maintaining distinctive Norse devotional patterns. The economic impact of Viking activity extends beyond urban centers. Introduction of silver currency transforms exchange systems previously based primarily on cattle valuation and barter. International trade networks connect rural producers to distant markets through Norse-dominated ports. Some agricultural innovations spread from Scandinavian tradition, while shipbuilding techniques influence coastal communities, regardless of their inhabitants' ethnic origins. These economic changes alter social relationships by creating new paths to wealth less directly tied to traditional status hierarchies. Artistic and cultural exchange flows in multiple directions. Irish ecclesiastical traditions influence religious art in Norse settlements, while Scandinavian aesthetic elements appear in Irish metalwork and sculpture. Literary traditions interact as Norse sagas incorporate Irish elements, and Irish narratives adopt motifs from Norse storytelling. This creative conversation produces hybrid forms distinct from either parent tradition, demonstrating cultural encounters' generative potential alongside its disruptive aspects. Gender patterns show interesting variations in areas of cultural contact. Norse women generally held greater property rights and social autonomy than their Irish counterparts in early medieval law, potentially influencing practices in areas of settlement. Archaeological evidence from female graves in Hiberno-Norse contexts shows individuals buried with both Irish and Norse cultural markers, suggesting women's particular role in cultural mediation through intermarriage and household management. By the late 11th century, the distinctive Hiberno-Norse identity becomes increasingly integrated into broader Irish society while maintaining certain cultural characteristics. The Anglo-Norman invasions beginning in 1169 introduced new political dynamics, with many Hiberno-Norse towns initially welcoming Norman overlordship as preferable to submission to Irish kings, only to find themselves subject to increasingly restrictive policies as Norman control solidifies. The complex legacy of this two-century encounter extends far beyond military conflict. Norse influence contributed to Ireland's urbanization, expanded its economic horizons, introduced new technologies and artistic motifs, and catalyzed political developments that might otherwise have unfolded differently. Rather than representing simple conquest or assimilation, the Viking experience in Ireland demonstrates how intercultural encounters create new social realities that transcend their constituent elements. As we move through Ireland today, Norse presence remains visible in place names, toponyms with ford elements, or places like Howth derived from Old Norse höfud, meaning headland, in urban street patterns established during this period, in genetic contributions to populations, particularly in coastal regions, and in cultural motifs that blended Norse and Irish elements to create distinctive hybrid traditions. As Norse words blend into Irish speech, so too do bloodlines merge, creating something neither fully one nor the other. This synthesis, sometimes violent, sometimes cooperative, always complex, characterizes not just the Viking period, but Ireland's recurring historical pattern of absorbing influences while maintaining distinctive cultural continuity. Thus, dragons fade from the horizon, their sailors become farmers and townspeople, their gods give way to Christ, but their contributions weave permanently into the complex tapestry of Irish identity, another layer in the palimpsest of cultures that forms this island's unique historical inheritance. Conquerors who became more Irish than the Irish themselves. The Anglo-Norman invasion, beginning in 1169, represents the most profound transformation of medieval Ireland's political, cultural, and physical landscape. Unlike previous incursions, this interaction introduced systematic feudal concepts, sophisticated administrative structures, and architectural forms that would permanently alter the Irish environment. The invasion's origins lie in complex Irish politics rather than simple external aggression. When Diarmaid mac Machada, the deposed King of Leinster, sought assistance from Henry II of England, he inadvertently initiated a process that would far exceed his intended restoration to power. Standing on the shore at Bannow Bay in May 1169, you witness the arrival of the first Anglo-Norman knights, heavily armoured horsemen whose military technology and disciplined approach to warfare represent capabilities beyond anything previously seen in Ireland. The initial Norman successes demonstrate their military advantages. At Baginbun, a small force defeats much larger native Irish numbers through superior technology and tactics. The conquest of Waterford and Dublin follows, establishing bases for further expansion. Within a remarkably brief period, substantial territories in Leinster and Meath come under Norman control, with native kings either displaced or accepting subordinate status as vassals. Henry II's arrival in 1171 transforms what might have remained private adventurism into formal royal policy. Standing among the crowd as the English king receives submissions from both Norman lords and Irish kings at Waterford, you witness the beginning of constitutional claims that will shape Irish-English relations for centuries. The king's purpose is twofold: asserting royal authority over his ambitious Norman vassals, while establishing direct overlordship over Irish territories rather than ruling through intermediaries. The Norman approach to controlling territory differs fundamentally from traditional Irish practices, where Gaelic politics emphasized personal relationships, client networks, and mobile kingship without fixed administrative centers. The Normans introduced territorial lordship based on clearly defined geographical boundaries, written records, and permanent administrative structures. This systematic approach, already proven effective in England and parts of Wales, allows rapid consolidation of authority despite the invaders' relatively small numbers. Castle construction provides both the physical means of territorial control and visible symbols of new authority. The initial wooden motte and bailey fortifications rise with remarkable speed across the landscape, serving as bases for further expansion. As Norman control solidifies, these temporary structures give way to stone castles of increasing sophistication. Standing before Trim Castle in County Meath or Carrickfergus in Ulster, you appreciate how these massive structures represent not just military advantages, but profound psychological statements, demonstrations of resources, technical knowledge, and organizational capacity that transform political relationships. Administrative innovation accompanies physical control. The introduction of shires, counties, and baronies imposes new territorial divisions that disregard traditional Irish boundaries. Royal officials, Sheriffs, justices, and exchequer officers established centralised authority previously unknown in Ireland. The foundation of towns with formal charters creates centres of trade and Norman culture, drawing merchants and artisans from England, Wales, and beyond. Walking through the narrow streets of New Ross or Kilkenny, you encounter a cosmopolitan atmosphere quite different from the rural settlements that previously characterised Irish life. But what begins as conquest gradually transforms into something more nuanced. The process historians call Gaelicization unfolds as Norman lords adapt to Irish conditions. Within generations, many of these families, the Burkes, Fitzgeralds, and others, adopt Irish customs, patronise Irish poets, speak the Irish language, and intermarry with Irish families. The phrase, more Irish than the Irish themselves, hiberniores hibernis ipsis, captures this cultural absorption. Legal principles reflect this blending. While English common law prevails in towns and areas under direct royal control, Brehon law continues in territories controlled by Gaelicized Norman lords or native Irish kings. The result is a complex legal pluralism where different systems operate simultaneously across the island. By the late 13th century, many Anglo-Norman lords employ both English and Irish legal specialists, moving between systems as circumstances require. As twilight falls over a Norman market town, you notice how the speech around you shifts fluidly between English, French, and Irish, embodying the cultural hybridization taking place. In the great hall of a Gaelicized Norman lord's castle, Irish harpers perform traditional tales, while the architecture and some customs remain distinctly Norman. This cultural mixing, though often presented as decline from a Norman perspective, represents instead a creative adaptation to Irish conditions. The English crown views this cultural assimilation with alarm. Legislation like the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366 attempts to halt the process, forbidding English settlers from adopting Irish dress, language, and customs. These efforts largely fail, demonstrating the powerful pull of Irish culture and the practical necessities of life in Ireland. By the 15th century, the area under direct English control has contracted to a small region around Dublin known as the Pale, while Gaelicized lords and resurgent Irish kingdoms dominate elsewhere. As you drift further into relaxation, contemplate how these Norman invaders, arriving as conquerors, found themselves transformed by the very land they sought to change. Boundaries that once seemed clear gradually blur, not unlike the edge between your consciousness and dreams right now. The Norman addition to Ireland's complex identity neither erased what came before nor remained untouched by it, creating instead something uniquely and authentically new that continues to resonate through centuries. Fingers that speak through, silver and gold. In the quiet workshops of medieval Ireland, hands perform a sacred dance across precious materials, continuing traditions ancient when Christianity first arrived on these shores. The artistic expressions of medieval Ireland represent not merely decorative impulses, but profound spiritual and cultural statements, preserving identity through periods of upheaval and change. The fusion of native Celtic artistry with Christian symbolism creates distinctive visual languages that continue to define Irish cultural identity. As the light of a tallow candle illuminates a metalsmith's workspace, you observe techniques passed through generations. Knowledge preserved despite Viking raids, Norman invasions, and political transformations. This continuity speaks to art's power as cultural memory, maintaining threads of identity through the most disruptive historical circumstances. Metalworking represents perhaps the most spectacular Irish artistic tradition. The remarkable Ardagh chalice exemplifies this mastery. Its silver bowl adorned with gold filigree panels displaying intricate interlace patterns. Standing before such objects, you appreciate how they combine practical function with spiritual significance and artistic excellence. These pieces require not just technical skill, but mathematical precision and deep symbolic understanding, representing the highest expression of Irish artistic genius. The techniques themselves tell stories of cultural exchange. Filigree work. Delicate ornaments created from tiny beads and twisted wires of gold shows connections to continental European traditions. Cloisonné, enamel work, where colored glass paste fills cells created by thin metal strips, reveals awareness of Byzantine practices. Yet these imported techniques become distinctively Irish through their application to native forms and patterns. The result is neither purely indigenous nor simply borrowed, but a creative synthesis reflecting Ireland's position at Europe's western edge, both isolated and connected. The interlaced patterns that characterize Celtic art express philosophical, as well as aesthetic values. These endless knots with no beginning or end symbolize eternity and interconnection, visual metaphors for spiritual concepts difficult to express in words. Following these patterns with your eyes induces a meditative state, not unlike the one you're entering now. The mathematical precision required to create such designs reveals sophisticated geometric understanding, while their organic quality suggests deep observation of natural forms. Stone carving translates these artistic impulses into more permanent form. High crosses, distinctive Irish Christian monuments, rise at monastery sites across the island, their surfaces covered with biblical scenes, abstract patterns, and, sometimes, inscriptions. The Muirdax cross at Monaster Boyce presents over 50 carved scenes, a visual Bible for those unable to read texts. Standing before these weathered monuments in the soft Irish rain, you sense how they connected heaven and earth, text and image, past and present for medieval viewers. Stonemasons translate artistic forms developed in precious metals and manuscripts into this most durable medium, ensuring their survival across centuries. The production of these crosses requires not just artistic vision, but complex technical knowledge. Quarrying suitable stone, transporting massive blocks, rough shaping before detailed carving, and finally raising these monuments demanded coordinated effort from specialists whose knowledge passed through apprenticeship systems. The concentration of high crosses around major monasteries suggests institutional support for these community projects that served simultaneously as teaching tools, devotional objects, territorial markers, and artistic expressions. Textile arts, though less preserved due to perishable materials, played equally important roles in medieval Irish life. Wool processing begins with sheep shearing in late spring, followed by cleaning, carding, spinning, and weaving, activities that structure the yearly rhythms of rural communities. The distinctive bainin, white flannel, becomes associated with the Western Islands, while more colourful patterns develop elsewhere. Standing in a small cottage, as women work wool by firelight, you appreciate how these domestic arts maintain cultural continuity through objects of everyday use, their patterns and techniques preserving identity as surely as more monumental forms. The cultivation of dyestuffs represents specialized horticultural knowledge. Wode for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow. Each requires specific growing conditions and processing methods. The resulting colors transform simple textiles into expressions of status and identity. When Irish legal texts specify compensation, payments including dyed garments, they acknowledge not just material value, but the specialized knowledge required to create them. What might appear simply decorative actually encodes complex social and cultural information, legible to contemporary viewers. Woodworking traditions bridge practical necessity and artistic expression. The carpenter's adze shapes roof beams for churches while also creating decorative elements that translate stone and metal patterns into wooden forms. Furniture, though rarely surviving from this period, must have displayed similar concerns with both function and beauty. When archaeological excavations recover decorated wooden objects from waterlogged sites, they reveal the same artistic sensibilities found in more durable materials, suggesting a unified aesthetic applied across different media by craftspeople, fully integrating beauty and utility. The organization of craft production reflects social structures. Some specialized artisans enjoy high status, with metalworkers and manuscript illuminators particularly valued. Irish law texts specify compensation payments for these professionals equivalent to minor nobility, acknowledging the cultural importance of their work. Other crafts operate more communally, with skills passed through family lines or local traditions. By the later medieval period, craft guilds develop in Norman-established towns. creating institutional structures to maintain standards and regulate training. Standing in a craftsperson's workshop as an apprentice carefully observes a master's techniques. You witness knowledge transmission that preserves cultural continuity across generations. As continental fashions influence Irish aristocratic taste, following Norman arrival, native artistic traditions adapt rather than disappear. The crozier of Clonmacnoise combines traditional Irish decorative motifs with Gothic architectural elements, demonstrating creative integration rather than simple replacement. Similarly, tomb sculptures incorporate both indigenous and imported elements, creating distinctive hybrid forms. This adaptive creativity, transforming external influences through native aesthetic principles, characterizes Irish artistic responses to changing political circumstances. The modern mind often separates art from craft, but medieval Irish creators recognized no such distinction. The same principles of design, symbolic meaning, and excellence in execution apply whether creating a monumental high cross or a wooden milk pail. This integration of beauty into everyday objects creates an environment where aesthetic considerations permeate daily experience. The humble rush lamp illuminating a farmer's cottage receives the same careful attention to form as the elaborate shrine housing a saint's relics, differing in material and complexity, but not in the fundamental approach to creation. As Irish scribes, metalworkers, and stone carvers passed their knowledge through generations, each contributed to cultural continuity that transcended political disruptions. When Viking raids destroyed monasteries, survivors carried manuscript techniques to new foundations. When Norman invasion introduced new architectural forms, Irish craftspeople incorporated these influences into distinctive hybrid styles. This creative resilience, maintaining core aesthetic principles while adapting to changing circumstances, defines Irish artistic identity through the medieval period. As artisans weave stories into metal and stone, monks weave words into the very fabric of history. The objects they create form bridges not just between materials and ideas, but across time itself, speaking from medieval hands to our modern understanding. Their work continues to resonate in contemporary Irish design, maintaining connection with patterns first developed 15 centuries ago. And as you sink deeper into comfort, these artistic traditions remind us that true creativity flows from deep cultural roots into new expressions, much as your conscious thoughts now flow gently into dreams. In the darkest of ages, the brightest of lights, while continental Europe experienced the fragmentation of Roman administrative structures and cultural institutions, Ireland, never part of the Roman Empire, developed a unique monastic tradition that would preserve and transform classical learning. These island communities became intellectual lighthouses, their illumination reaching far beyond Irish shores to influence European cultural development for centuries to come. The Irish monastic tradition begins with figures like Saint Finian of Clonard, whose foundation becomes known as the School of Saints, producing 12 apostles who establish monasteries across Ireland. Unlike continental monasteries developing within existing Roman infrastructure, Irish foundations create new centers of learning adapted to Irish social structures and geographical conditions. Standing in the early morning mist at Clonmacnoise or Glendalough, you sense how these spiritual communities integrated prayer, scholarship, and artistic production in rhythms shaped by the Irish landscape itself. The physical architecture of these monasteries reflects their cultural position. Stone churches and round towers rise alongside traditional wooden structures, creating distinctive ensembles unlike continental monasteries. The round tower, that uniquely Irish architectural form, serves multiple functions: bell tower, lookout post, refuge during raids, and landmark visible across the surrounding countryside. These tall structures orient both physical and spiritual landscapes, their presence announcing centers of learning and devotion across the island. Daily life within these communities follows rhythms determined by prayer times, seasonal changes, and scholarly activities. The monastic day begins with nocturnes, prayers in darkest night, followed by matins at dawn, then continuing through the hours until compline concludes the day. Between these prayer periods, monks engage in manuscript production, teaching, agricultural work, and administrative duties. Standing in a monastery courtyard as bells mark the hours, you appreciate how this structured existence creates stability conducive to intellectual development and artistic creation. The Irish contribution to manuscript culture represents perhaps their most significant legacy. The distinctive insular script develops from half-uncial forms brought by continental missionaries but transforms into something uniquely Irish, clear, compact, and beautiful. Innovations like word separation, rather than continuous text, and systematic punctuation improve readability, while abbreviation systems allow more efficient use of precious parchment. These practical improvements reflect Irish commitment to text not merely as preserved object, but as living communication medium. The creation of manuscripts involves sophisticated division of labor. Parchment preparation requires specialized knowledge, from selecting appropriate animal skins through cleaning, stretching, and finishing processes. Scribes prepare inks from organic materials, often using oak galls with iron sulfate for black ink and various mineral and plant sources for colored pigments. Page layouts are carefully planned before writing begins, with space reserved for decorative elements. Standing at a scribe's desk as he mixes ink and tests a freshly cut quill, you appreciate the material foundation supporting intellectual and artistic work. The illumination traditions developing in Irish scriptoria transform manuscript production from simple text copying to integrated artistic creation. Initial letters expand into elaborate carpet pages, their interlace patterns echoing metalwork designs while incorporating zoomorphic elements and symbolic colors. Biblical narratives appear alongside abstract decoration, creating visual theology accessible to viewers regardless of literacy level. The Book of Durrow, Lindisfarne Gospels, and ultimately the Book of Kells represent the highest achievements of this tradition. Manuscripts functioning simultaneously as texts, artworks, and sacred objects. Educational practices within these. Monasteries combine traditional Irish methods with Christian learning. The close relationship between teacher and student, fundamental to pre-Christian Irish education, continues in monastic settings, creating personalized transmission of knowledge. Latin literacy develops alongside continued appreciation for Irish language and literature, producing a distinctive bilingual intellectual culture. Mathematical knowledge supports both practical needs like calculating Easter dates and artistic creation of geometric manuscript decorations. Standing in a monastic school as young oblates recite Latin texts, you witness the formation of minds that will maintain intellectual traditions through turbulent centuries. The curriculum encompasses far more than religious texts. Classical authors like Virgil, Cicero, and Pliny remain part of monastic education, while Greek studies, increasingly rare in Western Europe, continue in some Irish centres. Scientific texts on astronomy, geography, and natural history receive careful attention, their contents integrated with Christian worldviews. Medical knowledge combines classical sources with indigenous healing traditions. This comprehensive approach to learning creates intellectual frameworks capable of absorbing and transmitting diverse knowledge systems. Perhaps most remarkably, Irish monks developed distinctive approaches to biblical interpretation and theological thinking. The penitentials, texts outlining appropriate penances for various sins, demonstrate subtle psychological understanding and practical pastoral wisdom. Exegetical works reveal sophisticated grammatical analysis and literary sensitivity. Philosophical texts engage with complex metaphysical questions through uniquely Irish conceptual frameworks. Standing in a monastery library as scholars discuss interpretive problems, you appreciate how geographical isolation fostered intellectual independence, allowing distinctive approaches to develop away from continental orthodoxies. This intellectual flourishing doesn't remain confined to Ireland. Beginning in the late 6th century, Irish monks established foundations across Europe, from Iona in Scotland to Bobbio in Italy, Luxeuil in France to St. Gallen in Switzerland. These peregrini pro Christo, wanderers for Christ, bring distinctive Irish approaches to scholarship, manuscript production, and monasticism to continental settings. Their influence on European intellectual development remains visible in manuscript collections across former Carolingian territories, where Irish innovations in script, decoration, and textual analysis transform local traditions. The arrival of Viking raiders beginning in the late 8th century disrupts this monastic culture. Major centers suffer attacks, with precious manuscripts destroyed or removed to safer locations. Yet even this disruption stimulates cultural developments, as dispersed monks establish new foundations or strengthen existing communities away from vulnerable coastal areas. The Viking presence ultimately becomes another influence absorbed into Ireland's evolving cultural synthesis, with Norse loanwords entering Irish vocabulary and artistic motifs incorporated into manuscript decoration. Norman arrival brings further changes to monastic life. Continental religious orders, Cistercians, Augustinians, Dominicans, and Franciscans, establish foundations following Norman patterns rather than indigenous Irish models. These new communities introduce architectural forms and organizational structures different from native Irish monasticism. Yet influence flows in both directions, with distinctively Irish elements incorporated into these imported traditions. Standing in the ruins of Mellifont Abbey, Ireland's first Cistercian foundation, you notice how continental architectural principles adapt to Irish conditions, creating another hybrid cultural form. Throughout these transformations, Irish commitment to learning as spiritual practice remains constant. When political disruptions threaten established centers, new foundations preserve essential traditions. When continental innovations reach Irish shores, they're integrated with existing practices rather than simply replacing them. This adaptive resilience, maintaining core intellectual commitments while responding creatively to changing circumstances, characterizes Irish monastic culture throughout the medieval period. As you drift deeper into comfort, imagine these quiet scholars by candlelight, their devotion a lullaby across time. Their patient work, preserving and transmitting knowledge, created foundations for later intellectual developments far beyond Ireland's shores. The manuscripts they produced remain among the most beautiful books ever created, their pages connecting us directly with hands that worked 15 centuries ago. And as your consciousness gently dissolves into sleep, consider how their legacy continues in our own valuing of learning, beauty, and the written word, timeless illuminations in our own uncertain age, stories that breathe alongside history. The medieval Irish inhabited two interconnected worlds, the tangible realm of daily existence and the mythic landscape where heroes, gods, and supernatural beings enacted eternal dramas. These were not separate domains, but interpenetrating realities, with physical locations serving simultaneously as historical sites and portals to otherworldly encounters. To understand medieval Irish consciousness requires appreciating how myths and legends provided not escapist entertainment, but fundamental frameworks for interpreting experience. The great narrative cycles of Irish tradition developed through centuries of oral transmission before being recorded by Christian monks. These scribes, working within monasteries dedicated to the new faith, nonetheless recognize the cultural importance of pre-Christian stories, preserving them with remarkable fidelity while occasionally adding Christian interpretive frameworks. Standing in a monastery scriptorium as a monk carefully transcribes tales first composed centuries earlier, you witness cultural preservation transcending religious boundaries, creating textual monuments as significant as any stone structure. The Ulster cycle centres on the northern kingdom of Ulster and its king Conchobar MacNessa, but finds its greatest hero in the youthful Cú Chulainn. The Táin Bó Cúailnge, cattle raid of Cooley, the cycle's central narrative, describes conflict between Ulster and Connaught over possession of a magnificent bull. Beyond this apparently straightforward premise lies complex exploration of heroic ethics, martial values, gender roles, and supernatural intervention. Cú Chulainn's defence of Ulster single-handedly against Connaught's armies establishes the paradigm of the exceptional individual whose extraordinary abilities create both opportunity and isolation. Cú Chulainn embodies heroic contradictions through his battle fury, Riastrad, a transformation rendering him simultaneously magnificent and monstrous, beautiful and terrifying. His body contorts, one eye bulges while the other recedes, blood rises to his head, and a column of light extends from his skull. This terrifying metamorphosis suggests heroism's cost, the loss of ordinary humanity required to achieve superhuman feats. His precocious childhood feats, youthful training with the warrior woman Scathach, tragic killing of his son Conla, and ultimately his heroic death while tied to a stone pillar create a complete heroic biography exploring human potential and limitation. The Fenian cycle presents different values through stories of Finn MacCumhail and his warrior band, the Fianna. Where Ulster heroes operate within established social structures, the Fianna exist at society's margins, living wild in forests and mountains. Their values emphasize hunting prowess, poetic sensitivity, and loyalty to their leader rather than conventional social obligations. Finn himself combines martial excellence with poetic insight gained from tasting the salmon of knowledge, suggesting integration of physical and intellectual capacities as the heroic ideal. The Fianna's adventures frequently involve encounters with the otherworld, that parallel realm existing alongside ordinary reality. When Finn's son Oisin follows the beautiful Niamh to Tir na Nog, land of youth, he experiences 300 years as 3 days, returning to find all his companions long dead. This poignant tale explores temporal disjunction between mortal and immortal worlds, while also serving as metaphor for pre-Christian Ireland's relationship with its Christian present, a past still accessible through story, but irretrievably separated from contemporary experience. These narrative cycles provided medieval Irish audiences not merely entertainment, but models for understanding their own experiences. When legal texts cite heroic precedents to establish judicial principles, they demonstrate how mythic narratives shaped practical social arrangements. When genealogies connect contemporary kings with legendary figures, they legitimize present power through mythic association. When boundary disputes reference legendary events occurring at contested locations, they show how mythic geography overlays physical landscapes. Standing at an ancient stone alignment as a local recounts associated legends, you appreciate how stories transform topographical features into meaningful landmarks within cultural consciousness. The otherworld represents perhaps the most distinctive feature of Irish mythological thinking. Unlike the stark separation between natural and supernatural in other traditions, Irish conception presents thinly veiled boundaries between worlds, with certain locations, times, or conditions facilitating crossing between realms. Fairy mounds, Shidhi, certain lakes, caves, or misty areas serve as access points, while liminal times, dusk, dawn, or calendar boundaries like Samhain, November 1, and Beltane, May 1, weaken ordinary boundaries. This permeable cosmology creates heightened awareness of potential otherworldly encounters in everyday settings. The residents of this parallel realm, the Tuatha De Danann, originally appear as gods, but transform through Christian reinterpretation into fairies or nature spirits. Their continued presence in medieval Irish consciousness demonstrates remarkable cultural continuity despite religious change. When farmers leave milk offerings at fairy thorns or avoid disturbing certain natural features, they participate in practices stretching back millennia. These beings' ambivalent nature, neither wholly benevolent nor malevolent, but operating according to their own distinct values, creates complex rather than simplistic supernatural ecologies. Among the most persistent beliefs involves changelings, fairy children supposedly substituted for human infants. This disturbing concept addresses multiple anxieties: unexplained developmental difficulties, maternal fears about infant vulnerability, concerns about bloodline integrity, and social tensions around atypical individuals. While potentially leading to harmful practices toward affected children, these beliefs also created explanatory frameworks for situations otherwise bewilderingly painful, offering narrative coherence for inexplicable circumstances. Christianity. interacts creatively with these indigenous belief systems rather than simply replacing them. Saints' lives incorporate motifs from earlier hero tales, with miraculous powers replacing magical abilities while maintaining narrative structures. Holy wells, many originally sacred to pre-Christian deities, continue as devotional sites with Christian associations. Seasonal celebrations transform into Christian feast days, while preserving earlier ritual elements, standing at a holy, well as pilgrims perform devotional practices with ancient roots. You witness living synthesis rather than sequential replacement, with multiple religious layers simultaneously present and mutually informing. Stories of medieval Irish saints themselves blend historical record with legendary elaboration. When St. Brendan encounters monstrous sea creatures, floating islands, and crystal pillars during his legendary voyage, narrative patterns from Imrama, pre-Christian voyage tales, shape Christian hagiography. When St. Brigid's cloak miraculously expands to claim land for her monastery, the story combines Christian miracle with pre-Christian associations between the saint and a goddess of the same name. These narrative integrations demonstrate Irish Christianity's distinctive quality, not erasing indigenous traditions, but baptizing them into new religious contexts. The preservation of these stories through medieval monastic manuscript culture represents remarkable cultural continuity despite religious transformation. When Christian monks meticulously record tales of pre-Christian deities and heroes, they demonstrate intellectual openness, transcending simplistic opposition between pagan past and Christian present. The resulting textual treasure, compilations like the Book of Leinster, Yellow Book of Lecan, and Book of the Dun Cow, preserves narrative material that would otherwise have disappeared with the oral tradition that originally transmitted it. For medieval Irish people, these stories provided essential interpretive frameworks for understanding natural phenomena, social relationships, historical events, and supernatural encounters. When thunder echoes across mountains, it recalls Dagda's club striking the earth. When fog suddenly envelops travelers, it suggests boundaries between worlds have temporarily thinned. When unusual natural features mark the landscape, they evoke legendary battles or magical transformations. This storied landscape creates an environment where physical geography and narrative geography continuously interact, each informing perception of the other. These tales still whisper in the wind across Irish hills, waiting for ears that remember how to listen. Their endurance through centuries of political and religious change testifies to their psychological resonance and cultural significance. And as you drift deeper towards sleep, consider how these ancient stories continue shaping Irish identity and artistic expression into our own time. Their patterns recurring in literature, their motifs appearing in visual arts, their themes informing music and dance. Like dreams that reveal deeper truths than waking thought, they connect us with fundamental human experiences transcending historical circumstance. Healing hands caught between prayer and potion. The medical traditions of medieval Ireland represent sophisticated synthesis of practical experience, inherited knowledge, and adaptive innovation. Neither purely empirical nor solely supernatural, Irish healing practices integrated multiple approaches within coherent frameworks reflecting cultural values and environmental understanding. The manuscripts preserving these traditions reveal not primitive superstition, but complex healing systems responding to their particular context. The physical environment shapes both health challenges and therapeutic responses. Ireland's damp climate exacerbates respiratory conditions and joint ailments, while its botanical diversity provides abundant medicinal plants. Standing in a monastic herb garden as morning mist rises, you observe careful cultivation of both native and imported medicinal species, evidence of systematic approach to ensuring therapeutic resources. The medieval Irish healer interprets illness and wellness within this specific environmental context, developing treatment approaches intimately connected with local conditions. The social organization of medical knowledge creates distinctive professional lineages. Hereditary medical families like the O Leanayan and Macan Leaga, maintain specialized knowledge through generations, their manuscripts passing from father to son along with practical training. These dynasties serve particular noble families or regions, creating stable relationships, facilitating knowledge accumulation through extended observation and consistent application. By the later medieval period, some practitioners study at European universities while maintaining connections with indigenous traditions, creating multi-layered medical approaches drawing from multiple knowledge systems. The surviving medical manuscripts reveal sophisticated understanding of human anatomy, disease processes, and therapeutic interventions. Texts like Rosa Anglica, translated into Irish by O. Quinn, present systematic approaches to diagnosis and treatment organized according to bodily systems and disease categories. Surgical techniques described include procedures for trepanation, skull opening, wound closure, bone setting, and bladder stone removal, demonstrating practical anatomical knowledge gained through observation and experience. Standing in a physician's house as he examines a patient by candlelight, you observe careful attention to pulse, skin color, urine characteristics, and patient narrative, diagnostic methods integrating physical signs with experiential factors. Herbal medicine forms the foundation of therapeutic practice. The Irish landscape provides abundant medicinal plants, from humble nettles and dandelions to specialized species like sundew and bog myrtle. Knowledge of gathering times, preparation methods, appropriate dosages, and specific applications passes through both formal medical lineages and informal community networks, typically maintained by women. This botanical knowledge represents not static tradition, but dynamic system, incorporating both indigenous discoveries and imported information, continuously tested through practical application. Specific preparations reveal sophisticated pharmaceutical understanding. Herbal compounds often combine multiple ingredients based on complementary properties. Pain-relieving herbs paired with anti-inflammatory agents, for instance. Different preparation methods. Infusions, decoctions, poultices, salves, tinctures. Extract different medicinal properties from the same plant material. Preservation techniques allow seasonal materials to remain available year-round. When medieval, manuscripts specify precise measurements, preparation methods, and administration protocols. They demonstrate methodical approach to therapeutic standardization. Surgical interventions complement herbal treatments for appropriate conditions. Irish medical texts describe setting broken bones using traction techniques, followed by stabilization with wooden splints. Wound management involves cleaning, debridement of damaged tissue, and specialized dressings, often incorporating antimicrobial substances like honey or specific herbs. More complex procedures include trepanation for relieving pressure from head injuries and tooth extraction using specialized tools. Archaeological evidence from medieval burials shows healed fractures and successful amputations, demonstrating effective surgical care despite limited technology. Diet forms another therapeutic domain. Irish medical understanding recognizes food's role in both maintaining health and addressing illness. Different foods are classified according to their elemental qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and matched to patient conditions requiring balancing influences. Specific dietary recommendations appear for various ailments, particular foods to consume or avoid during recovery from different conditions. These nutritional approaches integrate with seasonal availability and social status, creating personalized dietary guidance within environmental and social constraints. Mental health receives specific attention within this medical system. Conditions we might now classify as depression, anxiety, or psychosis appear in Irish medical texts with specific terminology and treatment approaches. These include not only herbal interventions, but also music therapy, controlled exposure to particular environments, and social prescriptions. The integration of psychological and physical factors within holistic understanding of human health demonstrates sophisticated appreciation for mind-body connections centuries before their rediscovery by modern medicine. The boundary between natural and supernatural healing remains permeable in medieval Irish practice. Prayers, blessings, and religious objects often accompany physical treatments, creating integrated therapeutic approaches addressing multiple dimensions of illness experience. Healing wells combine physical properties of mineral-rich waters with spiritual significance through saintly associations. Verbal charms blend Christian prayers with pre-Christian formulations, demonstrating cultural synthesis rather than simple replacement. Standing beside a patient receiving both herbal medicine and spoken healing charm, you witness integrated approach, acknowledging both material and non-material aspects of healing process. This integration extends to preventive practices and public health measures. Seasonal rituals marking calendar transitions include purification elements with practical hygiene benefits alongside symbolic significance. Community regulations regarding waste disposal, water source protection, and food handling appear in both secular and religious contexts. Monastic rules specifying personal hygiene practices, regular bathing, and environmental management reveal systematic approach to collective well-being beyond individual treatment. Astronomical knowledge informs both practical timekeeping and medical practice. Understanding celestial cycles supports agricultural planning, religious observances, and therapeutic timing, with certain treatments considered more effective during particular lunar phases or seasonal points. Irish scholars demonstrate sophisticated understanding of astronomical calculations, particularly for determining Easter dates, according to complex algorithms combining solar and lunar cycles. The astronomical observations required for these calculations represent systematic data collection across generations, revealing methodical approach to natural phenomena. This astronomical understanding extends to broader cosmological frameworks, integrating physical observations with philosophical interpretations. The universe appears as ordered system whose patterns reflect divine intention while operating according to discernible principles. Human health exists within this ordered cosmos, influenced by planetary movements, seasonal changes, and elemental relationships. Medical practice therefore requires not just knowledge of specific remedies, but understanding of how human bodies relate to larger cosmic patterns, a perspective simultaneously scientific and spiritual in modern terms. Agricultural practices demonstrate similar integration of practical observation with inherited knowledge. Crop rotation, soil amendment techniques, and livestock breeding practices reveal sophisticated environmental understanding developed through generations of careful observation. Agricultural calendars coordinate activities with seasonal conditions, optimizing limited resources through systematic planning. When meteorological knowledge helps predict weather patterns affecting both agriculture and human health, it demonstrates integrated approach to environmental interaction rather than separate knowledge domains. As they sought to mend bodies and understand stars, they reached for the same comfort you seek now in the darkness. Their manuscript pages preserve knowledge systems addressing fundamental human vulnerability to illness, injury, and environmental challenge. The continuing relevance of some traditional remedies, confirmed by modern pharmacological research, identifying active compounds in historically used plants, testifies to observational accuracy underlying these practices. And as your consciousness gently dissolves towards sleep, consider how these medieval healers' holistic perspective, integrating physical, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions of health, resonates with contemporary reconsiderations of fragmented modern medical approaches. He was born to the sea and its mysteries. The story of St. Brendan of Clonfert, c. 484 c. 577, weaves historical truth with legendary elaboration, creating narrative simultaneously historical document, spiritual allegory, and adventure tale. Attempting to separate these elements reflects modern categorical thinking foreign to medieval consciousness, which recognized multiple interpretative layers operating simultaneously without contradiction. Brendan's voyage becomes more rather than less meaningful through this multiplicity, each dimension revealing different aspects of medieval Irish engagement with faith, geography, and human limitation. The historical Brendan emerges from reasonably reliable sources as significant ecclesiastical figure in 6th century Ireland. Born in what is now County Kerry, he studies under notable teachers including St. Ita and St. Erc, before establishing important monasteries at Ardfert and Clonfert. His activities place him within the first generation of Irish monastic founders, following Patrick's mission, helping establish institutional structures that would define Irish Christianity for centuries. Contemporary references from other saints' lives confirm his historical existence and significance, while archaeological evidence from his foundation sites provides material connection with his actual presence. Yet this historical figure becomes vessel for extraordinary narrative. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani, Voyage of St. Brendan, composed in Latin probably during the 8th century and subsequently translated into virtually every European vernacular language. This remarkable text describes a 7-year voyage undertaken by Brendan and select companions, seeking the Terra Repromissionis Sanctorum, promised land of the saints. Their journey encounters fantastic islands, extraordinary creatures, and remarkable natural phenomena, creating travelogue moving between physical geography and spiritual landscape. The narrative begins conventionally enough. Brendan, hearing accounts of marvelous islands from another monk named Barinthus, decides to seek these wonders himself. He selects 14 companions, builds a traditional Irish carrack, leather-covered wooden-framed boat, and provisions it for extended journey. This practical preparation grounds the fantastic elements to follow in realistic details familiar to coastal Irish communities. Standing on western shore as Brendan and his companions launch their vessel into Atlantic waves, you appreciate the genuine courage required for such voyages in small craft vulnerable to ocean's immense power. What follows transcends simple travel narrative. Brendan and his companions discover Island of Giant Sheep, encounter singing birds who are actually souls in temporary form, celebrate Easter on the back of a giant fish named Jasconius, witness crystal pillar rising from the sea, observe smiths hurling molten slag at their boat, and finally reach their destination, a paradisal land of perpetual daylight and abundant fruits. These episodes function simultaneously as entertaining adventures, spiritual allegories, and possibly transfigured accounts of actual North Atlantic phenomena. The crystal pillar likely describes iceberg, while island that proves to be fish reflects dangers of landing on sleeping whales, a warning found in Nordic sailing literature as well. Descriptions of volcanic activity suggest possible Icelandic encounters, while Paradise Island with lush vegetation might represent actual North American landfall. When modern scholars trace ocean currents and sailing routes described in Navigatio, they discover its directions could indeed carry vessels from Ireland to North America via Iceland and Greenland. The text's accurate descriptions of natural phenomena like icebergs, unlikely to be invented by authors who never encountered them, suggest genuine observational foundation underlying fantastic narrative. The symbolic dimensions operate alongside geographical possibilities. Jasconius the fish represents baptismal death and resurrection, when monks celebrate Easter Mass on his back before he submerges. The island, where monks find table laid with food, but see no inhabitants, suggests Eucharistic mystery. Dark shrouded island, where souls undergo purgation, creates physical geography for theological concept. These allegorical elements transform physical journey into spiritual pilgrimage, each location representing stage in soul's progress toward divine encounter. The text's remarkable popularity throughout medieval Europe testifies to its resonance beyond purely Irish context. When translated into Old French, Middle English, Norwegian, Italian, and other languages, it joins international corpus of voyage literature linking geographical exploration with spiritual quest. Its influence appears in Dante's Divine Comedy, Columbus's voyage journals, and cartographic representations, including the 1492 Beheim Globe, which marks St. Brendan's Islands in mid-Atlantic. This cultural impact transcends questions of historical authenticity, demonstrating narrative's power to shape imagination, regardless of literal facticity. Scientific and historical interest in Brendan's voyage revived during 20th century, when scholars began reconsidering medieval accounts previously dismissed as pure fantasy. The possibility that Irish monks reached North America centuries before Norse explorers gained credibility through archaeological discoveries of Viking settlements at Lance-aux-Meadows in Newfoundland demonstrating pre-Columbian European contact with North America. While no physical evidence yet confirms Irish presence, the technical feasibility of such voyages was dramatically demonstrated in 1976–77, when Tim Severin successfully sailed leather-hulled currach from Ireland to Newfoundland, following route described in Navigatio. Severin's expedition revealed remarkable accuracy in text's practical details. The boat construction methods described function effectively for North Atlantic conditions when properly executed. Navigational information regarding currents, prevailing winds, and sailing times corresponds with actual conditions. Descriptions of natural phenomena, sea ice, icebergs, whales, volcanic activity, match features encountered along this route. While not proving historical voyage occurred exactly as described, these correlations suggest narrative incorporating genuine maritime knowledge rather than pure invention. The Brendan narrative exemplifies medieval Irish integration of physical and spiritual dimensions. The ocean voyage represents simultaneously geographical exploration and soul's journey toward divine encounter. Islands visited exist both as physical locations and symbolic spiritual states. Creatures encountered function both as actual North Atlantic fauna and metaphorical representations of spiritual realities. This interpenetration of material and transcendent realms characterizes medieval Irish consciousness more broadly, with physical landscape continuously inhabited by multiple layers of meaning. This layered understanding extends to text itself. The Navigatio exists simultaneously as travel document, hagiographic account, spiritual allegory, and entertainment narrative, without these categories creating contradiction for medieval readers. Modern attempts to classify it as history or fiction impose anachronistic categories foreign to medieval thought, which recognized multiple simultaneous truth claims operating at different levels. The text's enduring fascination derives partly from this rich, multi-layered quality, offering different dimensions to readers approaching from different perspectives. If Irish monks indeed reached North American shores centuries before Columbus, they traveled not as colonizers, but as pilgrims, seeking sacred encounter rather than territorial possession. This fundamentally different orientation toward exploration reflects distinctive medieval Irish attitudes toward journey itself, seeing travel as spiritual practice rather than merely geographical displacement. When Brendan finally reaches Promised Land, he's instructed to return home rather than remain, completing circular journey rather than linear conquest, another distinctively Irish narrative pattern. The Brendan voyage tradition continues informing Irish cultural identity into modern period. When contemporary Irish writers and artists reference this narrative, they connect with centuries-old archetype of spiritual physical journey, transcending ordinary limitations. The figure of Brendan, simultaneously historical ecclesiastic, legendary voyager, and symbolic pilgrim, embodies Irish Christianity's distinctive synthesis of pragmatic engagement with physical world and mystical orientation toward divine encounter. His journey across physical ocean doubles as soul's journey toward transcendent reality, creating narrative resonating across 15 centuries. The human drive to explore unknown territory, whether geographical, intellectual, or spiritual, finds perfect expression in Brendan's voyage. Standing on Ireland's western shores as Atlantic waves crash against ancient cliffs, you sense how this threshold position between known land and mysterious ocean shaped Irish consciousness throughout medieval period. The horizon always invites further journey, whether in physical boats or through contemplative practice. And as your own consciousness drifts towards sleep's unexplored territories, Brendan's voyage offers reassurance that mysteries encountered lead ultimately toward wonder, rather than terror. She commanded the tides of history, though traditionally associated with 16th century rather than earlier medieval period. Graine Nimhaile, anglicized as Grace O'Malley and popularly known as Granuaile, represents culmination of medieval Irish traditions regarding female leadership, maritime culture, and resistance to external authority. Her remarkable life bridges medieval and early modern periods, demonstrating both continuity with earlier Irish social patterns and adaptation to changing political realities. Standing on stone battlements of her castle at Rockfleet as Atlantic winds whip your cloak, you sense how this extraordinary woman embodied fierce independence, characteristic of Ireland's western seaboard. Born around 1530 to the O'Malley family, traditional maritime lords controlling western Mayo coastline and nearby islands, Gran inherited political position normally reserved for men. The O'Malley clan maintained centuries-old tradition as monarchs of the western seas, controlling shipping through their waters and maintaining substantial fleet for trading, fishing, and military purposes. Their political power derived primarily from maritime rather than agricultural resources, creating distinctive cultural orientation toward ocean rather than land as primary domain. This maritime focus created exceptional opportunities for female leadership, absent in more agriculturally oriented regions. Legends claim young Grain denied place on father's trading expedition because her long hair might catch in ship's rigging, cut her hair short, and proved her sailing abilities, earning nickname Graine Mahaol, Bold Grain. Whether historically accurate or not, this narrative captures essential truth about exceptional circumstances, allowing her eventual rise to power. The practical requirements of maritime life valued competence above gender conventions, creating space for female leadership when supported by demonstrated ability. Her first marriage to Donal and Shogaid o Flaith Partai, Donal of the Battle, connected her with another powerful Mayo family, extending her influence through alliance networks typical of medieval Irish politics. Following his death in battle, she returned to O'Malley territory, rather than remaining under her husband's family control, reasserting independent identity unusual for widows in most medieval contexts. This independence reflects distinctive features of Irish marriage customs and property rights, with Brehon law provisions allowing women to maintain separate property and political identity within marital alliances. Her subsequent activities demonstrate remarkable political and military leadership. She maintained substantial fleet, reportedly numbering 20 ships and several hundred sailors, conducting trading operations extending to Spain and Portugal, while also engaging in activities English authorities labelled piracy, but Irish tradition considered legitimate taxation of vessels passing through territorial waters. From bases on Clare Island and later Rockfleet Castle, she controlled significant portion of Ireland's western seaboard, collecting tribute from passing ships and maintaining political alliances through combination of military threat and diplomatic skill. Her second marriage to Richard Bourke, the MacWilliam Eochair, regional Norman Irish lord, demonstrates sophisticated political calculation. The marriage contract reportedly included unusual provision allowing separation after 1 year if either party wished, reflecting Grain's determination to maintain independence while securing valuable alliance. Their marriage celebration supposedly took place on board ship, symbolizing her primary identification with maritime rather than terrestrial power. When she subsequently dismissed her husband from Rockfleet Castle with phrase, "Richard Burke, I dismiss you," she demonstrated practical implementation of contractual equality extraordinary for the period. Her relationship with expanding English administrative authority reveals both diplomatic flexibility and principled resistance. As Tudor administration extended control into Connaught Province, traditional Irish lordships faced increasing pressure to conform with English governance systems or face military suppression. Grain navigated these dangerous waters through combination of strategic accommodation and determined defence of core interests. When English forces captured her son Tibbot Burke, she sailed directly to London to negotiate with Queen Elizabeth I rather than accepting her child's loss, an extraordinary diplomatic initiative demonstrating exceptional courage and political acumen. The 1593 meeting between these remarkable women, documented in English state papers, though reported without direct quotations, represents extraordinary cross-cultural encounter. Communication required translation between Irish and English, with Gran reportedly refusing to bow before Elizabeth, considering herself equal sovereign rather than subject. The discussion covered specific grievances, including confiscation of Gran's property and imprisonment of family members, with Elizabeth ultimately granting many requests, including her son's release and permission to continue maritime activities under certain conditions. This royal audience exemplifies Gran's exceptional ability to operate across cultural boundaries. Raised in Gaelic Irish traditions, yet capable of navigating Tudor English political expectations, she maintained core identity while adapting to changing political landscape. When she reportedly told Elizabeth, "From queen to queen I speak," she asserted traditional Irish understanding of leadership based on effective power rather than formal title, concept increasingly threatened by centralizing Tudor administrative practices imposing standardized governance models across diverse territories. Her later years witnessed continuing struggle to maintain autonomy as English control expanded through Connaught. Sir Richard Bingham, appointed governor of the province, pursued aggressive policies against Irish lords, with Gran particularly targeted due to her maritime power challenging English shipping control. Her properties suffered repeated attacks, her livestock was confiscated, and family members faced imprisonment. Yet she continued resistance through combination of direct military action, legal appeals to Dublin administration, and strategic alliances with both Irish and English-aligned forces, depending on specific circumstances. The remarkable longevity of her career, spanning approximately 5 decades of active leadership, testifies to exceptional political adaptability. From medieval Irish cultural context, emphasizing personal relationships, cattle raids, and traditional authority through transition toward early modern administrative structures, legal documentation, and centralized control, she maintained effective power through continuous adaptation. Her final years likely witnessed diminished influence as health declined and English authority consolidated. Yet her legacy remained powerful in regional memory and eventually national consciousness. This legacy transcends simple categories like pirate queen often applied in popular accounts. Gran operated within complex cultural context, where collecting tribute from passing ships represented traditional lordly right rather than illicit activity. Perspective, unintelligible within English legal frameworks, increasingly imposed on Irish territories. Her maritime focus maintained centuries-old orientation of Western Irish communities toward ocean as primary domain rather than supplementary resource. Her political leadership continued tradition of exceptional women who exercised power directly rather than through male relatives when circumstances permitted. Her story's preservation occurs initially through oral tradition rather than written documentation, creating challenges for historical reconstruction, but revealing cultural values prioritizing her memory. English administrative records provide factual framework through state papers, legal petitions, and military reports, while Irish bardic references and later folklore add dimensional understanding of her significance within indigenous cultural frameworks. The resulting composite reveals women operating successfully within male-dominated power structures while maintaining distinctive leadership approach, drawing from female experiences and perspectives. The extraordinary quality of her life sometimes obscures its representational aspects regarding medieval Irish women's potential roles. While certainly exceptional, Gran's leadership drew upon legitimate cultural precedents, including female property ownership under Brehon law, maritime traditions prioritizing competence above gender, and political structures allowing power, exercised through alliance and personal capability rather than exclusively inherited position. Other powerful women like Margaret of Desmond exercised significant authority within similar medieval Irish contexts, suggesting pattern rather than absolute anomaly. This contextual understanding challenges simplistic characterizations, rather than anachronistic feminist icon or romanticized rebel. Gran operated within specific cultural framework that, while patriarchal in many aspects, contained flexibility, allowing exceptional women to exercise direct power when combining capability with opportunity. Her remarkable achievement lies not in transcending her culture, but in maximizing possibilities within it, utilizing traditional structures while adapting them to personal circumstances and changing political landscape. The evolving English administrative presence particularly threatened such flexible power arrangements, Tudor governance models emphasize standardized legal frameworks, documented property rights, and administrative hierarchies less accommodating to personal authority based on demonstrated capability rather than formal position. Grainer's resistance to these changes represents not simply personal stubbornness, but defense of cultural system, allowing her leadership, understanding that emerging administrative structures would eliminate spaces permitting her exceptional but culturally legitimate authority. Her meeting with Elizabeth II symbolizes this collision between governance systems as much as personal confrontation between remarkable individuals. Elizabeth's consolidated monarchical authority contrasts with Grainer's leadership deriving from personal capability, family position, and effective control rather than formal constitutional role. Their negotiation represents not merely political settlement, but cultural translation between fundamentally different understandings of legitimate authority. Translation becoming increasingly necessary as medieval Irish political forms confronted early modern administrative structures. Grainer's story encapsulates broader patterns of Irish historical experience, resistance and accommodation, tradition and adaptation, indigenous values and external impositions. Her determined defense of personal and cultural autonomy while pragmatically navigating changing political realities mirrors larger Irish historical patterns. Like her homeland, she neither completely surrendered to external authority nor maintained unchanged independence, instead creating hybrid identity, incorporating multiple influences while maintaining distinctive core character. As you drift toward sleep, consider how her remarkable life illuminates not just individual courage, but cultural contexts, enabling unusual possibilities. The medieval Irish world, often portrayed as rigidly hierarchical, contained spaces of flexibility where exceptional individuals could transcend normal limitations. And perhaps in our own seemingly constrained circumstances, similar opportunities wait for those with courage to command the tides of history rather than merely riding their inevitable flow. Somewhere in the low light of an Irish scriptorium, a monk dips his quill into ink made of crushed oak galls and iron salts. The page before him is creamy calfskin, smoothed by hours of careful scraping, its surface ready to receive more than words, ready to become a world. Outside, the Atlantic wind sighs across the island's cliffs. But inside, all is still. Only the soft scrape of quill on skin and the breath of a monk immersed in silence. This is where the Book of Kells begins, not just as a manuscript, but as a revelation in ink. Created around the 9th century, though some scholars place its origins earlier, the Book of Kells is more than a gospel book. It is one of the most treasured artifacts of medieval Ireland, an illuminated manuscript containing the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. But to call it merely a religious text is to miss its deeper function. It is both scripture and spell, both worship and wonder, a visual symphony composed not in sound, but in colour, rhythm, and light. Its origins remain a quiet mystery. Was it begun on the remote Scottish island of Iona by monks fleeing Viking raids? Was it finished in the monastery at Kells in County Meath after those same raids forced a retreat inland? Like many medieval creations, its beginnings blur with the migrations and devastations of the time. What matters is that it survived. Over 680 pages of carefully inked majuscule letters, intricate knotwork, symbolic animals, and breathtaking illustrations, crafted without electric light, without magnifying glasses, with pigments made from crushed minerals and boiled plants. Some blues come from lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, some reds from lead and ochre, each pigment hand-ground, each hue chosen with intent. Look at a single page, and you're not just reading scripture, you're entering a visual cosmos. Letters become creatures, margins bloom into forests, patterns spiral into infinity. The Chi Rho page, which introduces the name of Christ, explodes with colour and intricacy. It's a meditation, a mandala, a dream. The book's iconography draws deeply from the well of both Christian and Celtic traditions. Angels float alongside interlacing knots. Evangelists take animal form: lion, eagle, ox, man. Serpents twist through letters. Fish hide among foliage. The borders of the divine and natural blur completely. In this way, the Book of Kells becomes not just a religious document, but a map of how the Irish monastic mind saw the world. Everything infused with spirit. Every line a prayer. Every curve a revelation. And yet, though it dazzles with glory, it is also marked by wear. Time has not spared it. Some pages are missing, others have faded. The book has been stolen, damaged, lost, rediscovered. One page was cut by a thief, hoping to sell the jeweled cover that once encased it. That cover is gone now, melted or sold, but the pages remain, fragile but resilient, a survival story in illuminated form. As you imagine the monks working, consider their devotion. They labored not for money or fame, but for faith. They believed that copying scripture was a sacred act, that beauty could bring souls closer to heaven, that the word of God deserved not just to be read, but to be seen in its full splendor. They did not sign their names. Their reward was spiritual, not social, and in a time when darkness closed in, when Vikings sacked monasteries, when war raged across kingdoms, when plagues thinned populations, these pages offered light, not only in theology, but in the sheer insistence of their beauty. To look at them was to be reminded that there was still order in the world, still wonder, still something untouched by chaos. We might think of the Book of Kells as medieval Ireland's Sistine Chapel, an achievement so extraordinary that it still silences those who behold it. Today, it lives in Trinity College Library in Dublin, protected behind glass, climate-controlled, watched over like a relic, because that is what it is, a relic of devotion, of imagination, of resilience. And yet, despite centuries past, despite the shifts in belief and culture, the book still speaks, not in words, but in presence. It does what great art always does. It arrests time. It reminds us of what is sacred, what is possible when hand and spirit work in harmony. Even its imperfections are beautiful. Smudged inks, corrections, faded areas. These flaws make it human. The monks were not divine. They were like us, tired, distracted, burdened with fears and hopes. And yet they returned to their work each day, adding lines to a gospel that would outlive them by over 1,000 years. As you lie back now, your breath softening, imagine the pages turning slowly, one by one, each leaf a hush, a heartbeat, a continuation. The text does not end, it flows, like a river of light through parchment. You do not need to believe what they believed. The beauty transcends the doctrine. You need only understand what they understood. That something deeper flows beneath the surface of life. And that beauty, deliberate, loving, sacred beauty, can hold us when the world feels too dark. The Book of Kells is not only a manuscript, it is a promise that devotion matters, that art matters, that care matters. And perhaps tonight, as you drift into dreams, something in you is illuminated too. Let it glow softly, like candlelight on vellum. Let it curl into your chest like a golden knot on the edge of a page. Let it remind you gently that even in chaos, beauty still chooses to survive. You've wandered far tonight, across misty valleys and monastic cells, through the halls of stone castles and the curves of illuminated letters, through storm-tossed seas and mythic forests. And now, like a tide returning to its shore, you find yourself back where you began. The fire in the hearth has gone quiet. Embers pulse like the final notes of a lullaby. Outside, the wind has softened. The trees, once whispering with old stories, now sway with slow, sleepy breath. All around you, silence gathers, not empty, but full of memory, full of meaning. As your body sinks deeper into rest, your mind drifts softly over the places you've seen. You remember the warmth of a stone cottage and the hush of a scriptorium. You remember the clang of iron and the melodies of bards, the cold edges of battle and the bright ink of gospels. Each memory not fixed, but floating, like mist over a still lake. And in these memories, you begin to recognize something unexpected. Not just the past, but yourself. Because history, when told gently, becomes more than names and dates. It becomes a mirror. The monks who rose before dawn to copy scripture in dim candlelight, they too once sought peace. The bards who wandered, from village to village, spinning tales for food and shelter, they too once longed to be heard. The warrior poets, the herbalists, the seafarers, the queens without crowns, they carried burdens that echo faintly in your own chest. Maybe that's why you stayed so long here. Because medieval Ireland, for all its distance and strangeness, does not feel entirely foreign. It feels like a dream you almost remembered. A story half whispered at the edge of sleep. A truth buried under time, but not lost. You saw what it meant to live in rhythm with the earth, to let seasons shape not just food and clothing, but thought and belief. You saw the sacred stitched into the ordinary, into wool, into stone, into ink. You saw a world where imagination was not separate from survival, but part of it. Where even hardship birthed beauty, because people believed that beauty mattered, even in famine, even in war, especially then. And as your eyelids grow heavier, you carry this lesson with you, that perhaps you too are made for wonder, that even in your modern noise and hurry, you can choose stillness. You can choose reverence. You can build tiny cathedrals in your everyday life, not with stone or gold, but with attention, with kindness, with care. You can pause just for a moment to breathe deeply, to listen to the silence beneath the noise, to remember that you belong to a long line of wanderers and workers and dreamers, those who shape the world not with power, but with presence. And just as Ireland's ancient hills hold the memory of every footstep, so does your life hold quiet, meaning in its simplest acts. So rest now, not as escape, but as return. Return to your own quiet power. Return to the stillness that holds you, even when the world feels uncertain. Return to the ancient truth that the night was never something to fear, but something to trust. It is in the darkness that the monks painted light. It is in the storm that Brendan heard God. It is in the silence that the bards remembered the songs. And it is in this moment, between waking and sleep, that you carry all their stories forward, not by doing anything extraordinary, just by resting, by listening, by remembering that your story too matters. Somewhere, far from here, the tide rolls in against a lonely Irish shore. A stone cross leans into the wind, and in the grass beside it, an old manuscript glows faintly in memory. Each letter a whisper, each page a promise. Let your breath follow that rhythm, in and out. The story is not over, but for now, it rests with you. Good night, and may peace find you where you are.